Well, actually, we now welcome you to the third day of the conference in honor of John Davies. I'm not Kostas Vlassopoulos, but I will be co-hosting this morning session, this morning panel, along with my colleague, my well-esteemed colleague, Paschalis. Paschalis, would you like to start?
Yes, of course. Good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear me. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Our first speakers today are Veronique Chankowski and Andrzej Chankowski. Veronique Chankowski is, in a sense, a fellow citizen for those of us living in Athens, since she's the new director of the École française d'Athènes. I am certain that most of you know her work on all aspects of ancient economy and markets, and on the history, epigraphy, and economy of Delos. I am equally certain that even those of you with a passing interest in the gymnasium, the ephebate, age groups in the ancient world, among many other things, know very well the work of Andrzej Chankowski from the University of Lille. And their subject today is change in the epigraphic sources.
If I may intervene and make a small correction, Andrzej Chankowski has just been appointed professor at the University of Poitiers. So very
Sorry,
many
I didn't know that.
Congratulations on our part. So he will be talking to us today from his new post.
Thank you. So thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you to the organizers and congratulations to John Davies. That's great to see you all. I still hope to visit Katerina and Kostas in Rethymno, since I'm now, in fact, Polikonda as Elpisume. I must say first that this paper was prepared in a very traditional way. It is a marital work with Andrzej. And we tried first to agree together and to bring together part of each experience we have on several epigraphic corpuses. I will try to share my screen. Sorry, I have to do maybe in a different way. Can you see the screen? Not yet, maybe.
Not yet.
Yes. Okay, that's probably better now. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I would like to have it. Okay. The question of change in epigraphic sources is wide and has been already addressed by several scholars, among them John Davies. There is certainly a need for a reappraisal of the whole topic, but this is only a small and very partial foray into this field as a tribute to John's work. The word change often appears in political slogans. It can be visible on the walls of our cities during election periods. And as you can see on this slide, then change is always for now. At the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 3rd century BC, this was certainly also what the citizens of several poleis of Asia Minor thought about the new era that was then opening up for them after the conquest of Alexander the Great and after the Diadochs Wars. At least this is how they expressed the perception of change through epigraphy. They were perhaps even replicating the impact of political slogans of the time when engraving the history of their city on stone. Aegean echoes as well about the democratic process that starts from the conquest of Alexander the Great. From this period, we have plenty of epigraphic text echoing a great political event that is presented as a decisive turn in local history and accompanied by constitutional changes. Let's look at some typical cases. After being freed from the domination of the satrap Asandros by Antigonos, the Milesians inaugurated in 313 a new list of Stephanephoroi, their eponymic magistrates, with a note engraved next to the name of the first Stephanephoros of the new era. Under this one, the city became free and autonomous through the decision of Antigonos, and democracy was restored. At Priene, a series of decrees contains a formula emphasizing that they were adopted Prieneon autonomon onton, when the Prieneans were autonomous. There is some discussion as to whether these decrees were adopted immediately after Alexander's passage or later, but this discussion does not concern us here. Whatever the time when they were voted, these decrees express the conviction that the Prieneans now live in a new era. And then around 280, the pronaos wall of the Athena temple of Priene was also covered with a set of inscriptions concerning royal decisions and privileges obtained by the Prieneans. The series begins with Alexander's dedication of the temple. And here, let us not forget that epigraphy is not only the study of text, but also the study of the monuments that support them, even if the organization of the epigraphic corpus does not always reflect this. Here, the dedication of Alexander is the first inscription, even if it bears the number 156 in the corpus. And in the case of Priene, it is obvious that the city wanted to gather a history of its rights since the beginning of the new era, which opened with Alexander the Great. However, this highlighting of a major political change, a break with the past, rather means exceptional situations out of the ordinary. On a daily basis, in their routine, the political communities manifest through the inscription a deep attachment to certain forms of conservatism that are formulated as continuities. It complies with the well-known fact that, unlike the contemporary world, Greek political systems were characterized by the affirmation of stability. It was not a change, but rather stability and the keeping of the established order that has to be protected against the neoterismos. The preservation of a city's ancestral constitution is often presented as a goal which should be pursued and as a value which has to be defended. We can quote here the decree of Antioch in Persis on its links with Magnesia on the Meander, where, as you can see, the Magnesian people are prized because of their capacity to preserve their ancestral constitution. With good fortune, by the council, be it resolved by the council and the people, to prize the people of Magnesia for their piety, etc., because they will preserve their ancestral constitution. For this reason, in the Greek public space, the political expression that appears in the inscriptions does not particularly bring out the notion of change. Troubles, instability, when evoked in epigraphy, are always accompanied by the expression of a return to order. This phenomenon can be easily exemplified through numerous epigraphic texts of different nature. For instance, in Kos, this monetary donation for the cult of Asclepius, where you see that people choose to engrave on the stone the refusal of change, mede alagenai, and to emphasize the aspect of continuity, eiston apanda chronon. And as you know, there are many parallels to this formula. At the legislative level, this desire to maintain political and social order finds its concrete expression in a clause what David Lewis has called entrenchment clause, that is a clause included in a decree or a law aimed at excluding any possible modification of its content. There is an example in the prospectus of the Second Athenian League, but as you know, a long list of entrenchment clauses from cities scattered over the whole Greek world can be found also in the well-known book of Lewis and Rhodes on the decrees of the Greek states. So this willingness of political communities to assert continuity or even certain forms of conservatism makes the analysis of change through epigraphy very complex. However, epigraphy remains, especially for the Hellenistic period where historiography is largely lost, a main window of observation of the political, social, and economic transformations of societies. But we have to keep in mind that this window is itself biased or blurred by a certain number of codes that relate to society's modes of public expressions. So let's address the question in a different way. Do the inscriptions themselves, by their very existence and form, testify of political and social evolution in the Greek world? The question of the epigraphic habit has been already addressed by several scholars, but how to measure its impact and to evaluate its meaning? Let us first recall some banalities. Public inscriptions are not documentary archives. They are created from other documents deposited in public archives, and they exist because a political community has decided for its own reasons to exhibit them in a public place in order to give them a monumental and perennial character. Engraving is a matter of choice, and many policy decisions were simply displayed on temporary media, such as bleached reusable tablets. Only a small part of decrees voted by Greek cities were engraved and exposed in their epiphanestatos topos. As Philippe Gautier used to repeat on several occasions, the reason why we have the impression that the Greek cities of the Hellenistic period debated only about how to honor their evergetai is not that other issues were not debated only and voted in their assemblies, but that decrees concerning other issues were not systematically engraved on stone and exposed in a public place. Moreover, epigraphy is not only decrees and dedications. Let's remember of the kilometers of inscribed walls and stelae that bear public financial accounts, for instance. So engraving and inscribing a monument has a cost that assumes an institution or an individual with a budget. It is not trivial for a city to choose to invest in inscriptions. It implies a decision to occupy a dedicated public space, but also a budget. So why do that? Engraving and inscribing a monument implies a desire to transmit information to the greatest number of people. Ancient epigraphy responds to a need for open access and communication in its way. It is therefore not surprising that engraving goes hand in hand with democracy. A decision taken by the people must be visible and exposed to all. It is therefore the development of Athenian democratic institutions during classical times that manifests itself first and foremost as an opportunity to multiply and develop public epigraphy. Of course, there has been a lively debate in recent decades as to whether the inscriptions were intended to be read or not, or were displayed in public places only for their monumental value. Behind this question is the problem of whether the societies of the Greek cities, and especially the Athenian society, were composed of people who could read. We do not enter here into this debate. We emphasize that we're on the side of those who consider that the inscriptions were done to be read and had a political and legal value when exposed in public space. For this reason, epigraphy is also a strong tool for the dissemination of ideologies and political communication. We know how much the Athenian Empire has used epigraphy in that sense. There is a debate about the democratic nature of the diffusion of the epigraphic habit in the 5th century BC, and some argue that there are not less inscriptions during non-democratic episodes at the end of the 5th century BC than during other periods. But it is clear that the democratic evolution of Athens, which it is itself inseparable from the imperial development of Athens, has created the necessary conditions for the emergence of an epigraphic habit. Later on, inscriptions from Greek cities in Asia Minor illustrate clearly the link between epigraphy and democracy. As we have already said, for many cities in this region, especially on the west coast, the conquests of Alexander and the period of the successors opened a new era in the history of their political regimes. In most of them, a democratic regime was established. That democratic regimes bear such a resemblance to Athenian democracy that we can reasonably conclude that it is influenced by the pre-existing Athenian model. This is evidenced in particular by the consecrated formula edoxe te boulei kaito demo, resolved by the council and the people. There are local variants of this model that can easily be studied thanks to the already quoted work of Lewis and Rhodes, but all of them bear witness of the same pivot of any democratic regime in the Greek world. That is the collaboration between a restricted body, a council, which prepares the topics, and the assembly, which debates and votes on them. We touch here the important question of the diffusion of institutions of the Athenian type in the world of the Hellenistic cities. Needless to recall that this phenomenon is known to us exclusively by inscriptions. Moreover, for the Greek cities of Asia Minor, the conquest of Alexander and the period of the diadoques open a new era, also in the form of their epigraphy. The establishment of democratic regimes in these cities, imitating the Athenian model, resulted in the multiplication of inscriptions. Poor until then, in the majority of the cases, the epigraphic documentation of these cities explodes after the expedition of Alexander. The already mentioned case of Priene, a medium-sized city whose political history is a little known to us, can once again be quoted as a good illustration of this idea. Before Alexander, we have no decree surely dated coming from this city. The new period, which opens with the expedition of Alexander, deliver at least 7 decrees written in the form, as you can see here in this example, written in the form that implies that this decrees has been adopted according to a democratic procedure. However, is the opposite conclusion correct? Does a decrease or a change in engraving practices mean a decrease in democratic practices? Are inscriptions the expression of the true nature of political communities? Let's look at 2 case studies. First case, the island of Delos has delivered thousands of inscriptions in different categories. Among this huge corpus, there are about 500 stelae of accounts and inventories dating from the 4th to the 2nd century BC. During this period, the city of Delos bears the responsibility of the administration of the sanctuary and makes it known by exposing the accounting of the sacred treasure. When the city of Delos was abolished by the will of Rome in 167 BC and replaced by an Athenian wardenship on the island, there were no great changes at first in the epigraphic habit. The Athenians continued to engrave, with their own organization of the text and their own accounting methods, the annual statement of the fortune of Apollo. It is only later, in the 140 that this practice disappeared and the engraving of the large accounting stelae came to an end. However, this situation does not mean that the sanctuary had ceased to be managed, because we know that Athenian magistrates continued to be appointed for this purpose. It can rather be explained by a loss of patrimonial interest for the engraving and reading of the information contained in these accounts. The accounts continued to be kept on perishable supports, but people stopped making engraved monuments to exhibit it. In fact, from this period onwards, the sanctuary was no longer at the center of Aegean economic activity. Its role of banker and entrepreneur was then assumed by private individuals who settled in this cosmopolitan island. This change of epigraphic habit should therefore be included in the historical narrative, since it does not correspond to the political caesura of 167 BC. But at the same time, the disappearance of the democratic city of Delos and its administrative responsibility had profoundly transformed the community of residents. This evolution created a change in the material and monumental form of the inscriptions. Consequently, it also had an impact on the visual aspect of the inscribed space and landscape. During the 3rd century BC, the sanctuary was covered with high stelae of accounts that dominated some honorary monuments. In the 1st century BC, the space between the buildings was covered by statues with dedications. One could not better materialize in a visual way the evolution that took place in a few decades around the middle of the 2nd century. This change is between a state and sanctuary-based economy, the 4th century to middle of the 2nd century BC, to a community and businessman-based economy from the middle of the 2nd century BC, as we can also understand it from other sources, but it was also visible in the landscape, in the public space of the Delian public center. But in spite of the Athenian guardianship of the sanctuary and the Roman order, the Delian people, while no longer citizens of a city, but representatives of various communities of foreign traders, still remained committed to democratic forms. We can find at this time, in many dedications of Delos, formulas which recall the attachment to the democratic forms that are also visible in communities of the Seleucid and Roman East. The expression of decision-making and sovereignty thus found new forms, but the attachment to engraving as an expression of a decision-making community persisted. Second case, in the discussion about the specificity of the lower Hellenistic period, we always come up against the same question of the extent to which a change in the style of documentation reflects a social and political change. Is it only a phenomenon of language, style, taste, or is it also a social phenomenon? Louis Robert, who drew attention to the style of political language of the lower Hellenistic period, saw the cause of this phenomenon in the appearance of a new social stratum with a taste forged by the rhetorical paideia of that period. It is this new aristocracy of the cities possessing a careful education, he wrote, which monopolizes the affairs of the cities by removing them from the sovereign action of the assembly of the people and democracy, said wrote Louis Robert. It must be said that this answer is not a priori obvious because a change of taste and culture does not necessarily mean social and political change. Of course, Robert's remark was not based only on an analysis of the style of the document, but on his exceptional familiarity with the period, as you can see here in their exploration of Asia Minor. And other scholars have since given other arguments to support his conclusions. However, we must never lose sight of the fact that when defining in this way the Hellenistic period, we are building on a cultural phenomenon, a change of style as perceived through inscriptions. Moreover, even in a new style, qualified as style ampoulé, complicated style, the epigraphy of the 2nd century BC deeply expresses the attachment of the civic communities of this period to ancient forms of sociability. Let us take the example of processions. It is a very ancient ritual, perfectly well attested since the classical period, but it is only from the first half of the 2nd century BC that we have frequently detailed descriptions of them in the decrees engraved on stone. And we are struck by the similarity of the descriptions, which show that not only did the processions of the lower Hellenistic period take place in very much the same way as in the upper Hellenistic period, but that it was globally the same in all the cities. The notions of identity and identity behavior prove to have little effect here. The cities do not show any specificity in their processions, except for the specificity linked to their local institutions, of course, but rather they conform to a common model. What the descriptions of these decrees highlight is indeed the existence of the same civic model inherited from the classical city, united around its magistrates attached to its political and religious institutions, concerned about the integration of young people, future citizens. It is clear that the authorities of the city seized any occasion to express an image of community cohesion through the descriptions written in the decrees and through the description of this sociability. But it occurs at a time when the political role of cities is obviously diminishing. The liveliness of this model goes against the political reality. The more the Hellenistic city is embedded in large structure, the more it celebrates its traditional civic model. This is even a frame in which the Hellenistic city also slightly introduces some illustration of social changes. For instance, in Pergamon, Diodoros Pasparos finds a place in the procession because of its social importance. And in the procession planned by Vibius Salutaris, in which symbols referring to the Roman universe are skillfully integrated, we can see also the same example of this permeability with the integration of Roman symbols with those representing the civic world of the Ephesians. It is not easy to measure the extent of the changes that have occurred for certain domains of political and social life, but it is very impressive to see that the city of the low Hellenistic period is unable to consider itself outside the terms of classical political life. It is interesting to note that social changes do not transform the image that the city gives of itself through the inscriptions, even when it endorses these changes. Rather, it integrates them into this general model of description of the procession. We can indeed speak of a conservatism of the cities of the low Hellenistic period, a conservatism which ensures the survival of the classical idea of the city in a very much changing and troubled world. Classical democracy remains a framework for expression of this in these political communities. This is not exactly the reality of their society, but neither is it necessarily nostalgia for a yesterday's world, a world that has disappeared. Epigraphy is a major tool in the creation of this idealized model, and it is supporting the expression of the communities as societies operating in this specific democratic way. It is also protecting the communities against too strong political and social changes, or even preventing them from radical changes because of the strength of collective expression. We find here again this link between democracy and epigraphy as it was built in the classical era and despite all the changes in style. So to conclude, epigraphic change is therefore multifaceted, and we have highlighted here only some of the many changes that occurred in ancient Greek epigraphic habit. Inscriptions as text on a monument offer a useful plasticity for the expression of ideologies and political discourses. But all bias must be carefully examined before making it a source of interpretation for changes in societies. Ultimately, epigraphy is rather a vector of affirmation of the desire to maintain the democracy as a model in a world in perpetual transformation, and as a tool for dissemination of information and communication on the social and political values of the city. It is intrinsically linked to the classical democratic city whose functioning it is the expression of. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now the floor should be open for discussion. I remind everyone, panelists and attendees included, that they can raise their digital hand if they press the participants button at the bottom of their screen, and then they will see at the bottom right a raise hand option. You please use this in order for us to know that you want to pose a question. Anyone? Yes, John Davies. We can't. Yes, now we can hear you.
Very sorry. Veronique, thank you very much for this very wide-ranging and most stimulating presentation. I am delighted to see Delos being highlighted in this way, and also the post-Alexander revolution in the documentation of the city-states of Asia Minor, which is a very welcome illustration indeed of change, as you say. What I notice is that you have been reviewing exclusively public inscriptions. And I wonder whether you would want to apply some of the same criteria that you identified to private inscriptions, whether those put up by cult institutions or, and particularly, private dedications and, of course, gravestones. These, I suspect, operate to an entirely different logic from the logic which is represented by public gravestones. But that is a proposition which I invite you to destroy.
Thank you, John. Of course, private epigraphy is a topic in itself, and let's say funerary epigraphy is also a topic in itself. But in general, I suppose that it's maybe not so different. For instance, Snodgrass, a very long time ago, had shown a strong evolution between the classical during the classical period, when offerings started slowly to become more and more modernized. And during the Hellenistic period, when you start to have offering consisting in a sum of money, endowment, and so on, it means that you have more and more people have more and more opportunities to materialize their offering through an epigraphic, an inscription, and not through an object, through an artifact. So I guess that maybe we could also, in a private epigraphy, guess the same kind of evolution. First, the growing up of manifestation of private offering of private exhibition in the public space, and also their expression through more and more developed texts than just a name on a stela. But yes, you're right that there are many topics in the question, and it's not possible to address all of them. But I'm quite sure that the question of the relationship between private and public epigraphy is going hand in hand, because private epigraphy is also a public manifestation.
Exactly.
So you have a connection between them. Andrzej.
Thank you.
If I can add just a small remark, but it concerns a completely different question, but related to the question of John. This is the question as to how, as if the changes in culture have some impact on inscriptions. This is, for instance, the topic of Chaniotis in his program of emotions in epigraphy. Yes. And everybody who reads epigrams knows that there is a very clear evolution of styles of epigrams, and the let's say funerary poetry of the low Hellenistic period and of the Roman period is very different from the funerary poetry of the classical period. So this is a change in the style of epigraphy, which reflects a change of culture. So the answer is here, yes, there is a big change in this respect.
Thank you.
If I may jump in the same vein as John Davies's comments, there are some categories of inscriptions where the absence or the presence of an epigraphic habit is still somewhat puzzling. Kostas Vlassopoulos a few years ago made a comment about manumission inscriptions. The geographic distribution of manumission inscriptions, frankly, does not make sense. There are almost no such inscriptions from Athens. There is Delphi, of course, there's Boeotia, there's Thessaly, plenty of sacred manumission inscriptions from Macedonia, some from the islands, not enough manumission inscriptions from the places where slavery was supposedly present in very large numbers. So one has to find some sort of explanation, I suppose, for this wild difference in epigraphic habits between areas. Yeah, sorry, Andrzej, you are muted.
No, it's okay, but I have no idea, so I am looking at Veronique. Anyway, it's a difference in culture. Yes, it's not a difference in society. So because, as you have said, slaves were everywhere, and manumissions was a general institution, so that cannot be explained in this way. You have to find an explanation in the epigraphic habit, but why, I don't know.
But we find manumission in sanctuaries, so the explanation is also maybe in the legal and economic systems that people were looking for when asking a sanctuary to assume the cost of the manumission. But again, it's a whole topic in itself.
Yes.
Other questions? Nikos Giannakopoulos.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Now, my question was very good paper, and since you are here, my question has to do with the following development. Okay, in the late Hellenistic period, we have a lot of long honorific degrees. Okay, some of them are quite interesting texts on their own. Some of them may be boring, but they are very long honorific degrees. From the 1st century AD onwards, these become very rare. Okay, we do have a lot of honorific inscriptions. We do not have degrees. Now, does this have to do with cost, with considerations of cost? Because this is a change in epigraphy. Okay, and I'm not totally convinced that I have an answer. This is why I'm asking you. Does this have to do with considerations of cost? Does this have to do with possible, one must say, decrease in the significance of displaying democratic procedures? Because honorific degrees do display, as you say, democratic procedures. So instead of having all these enactment formulas resolved by the bulle and the demos, we just have a honorific inscription still mentioning the bulle and the demos. So this is my question.
Nico, we are in the heart of this whole discussion about the transition between the, let's say, the Hellenistic, early Hellenistic period and the low Hellenistic period, and then the Roman period, the cities of the Roman period. And I think I would say that it's reasonable to take this this change of the epigraphic habit as a reflection, a witness of some political change, and but we can't deny it. We can say that it's only because of the way the people want to expose it in the public space, honors or attitude towards the people, that the change is only cultural and stylistic. I don't think so, but we have to have, I mean, external proofs that something has changed in order to interpret it correctly. I don't know whether I answered your question. I just
yes, of course you did.
Concerning the cost, dedication is not cheaper because you have also the statue and the agalma, and it costs. And it's very impressive to imagine that this multiplication of dedication in sanctuaries, for instance, means a multiplication of the capacity of the offer from sculptors and craftsmen. And I think that it's worth to quantify these evolutions, because nobody, I think, has imagined how many craftsmen, sculptors were needed to answer this demand with all the dedication that are multiplying in sanctuaries at this period.
Because you wanted to comment something? Okay. Edward.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much, Veronique, for that excellent overview. And again, it's a large topic, very large topic. And you did a superb job talking about these, about political institutions. And you mentioned briefly the associations. And I'm kind of, I'd like to kind of provoke Vincent Gabrielson to kind of get into this, because of course he has this splendid project in Copenhagen about associations. At any rate, I hope he'll come in later. One thing you also pose is an excellent problem of method. To what extent are we seeing institutional change? To what extent are we seeing change in just simply epigraphical habit? And it's an excellent methodological point we all need to keep in mind when dealing with inscriptions. I just want to talk about several categories where, for instance, the relationship is different. First of all, there are interstate arbitrations. Now, we know from literary sources that interstate arbitrations go back to the Archaic period. Piccirilli has done an excellent job, and Anna Magneto has also collected them for the epigraphic record. But this is something where, again, they don't show up. The arbitrations don't show up until the Hellenistic period, and then they're very long and detailed inscriptions. They're really very impressive. So here's a case where something is appearing in the epigraphic record, which we know from literary sources existed before that. Now, on the other hand, I want to take a contrary example, which are the Dionysiac artists. Now, the Dionysiac artists don't show up in literary sources either for the classical period or for the Hellenistic period. They all of a sudden start showing up in around 280. We don't know if the Athenian association or the Ptolemaic association were the first one, but at any rate, that seems to be. And Sophia Anaziri and Brigitte Le Guin have done excellent studies on this. And then they continue on down. So here's a case where it seems to be that the beginning of their appearance in epigraphy is also the beginning of their existence. So we have a different relationship. And the last one I want to talk about are foreign judges. Foreign judges are also, again, don't show up in the literary record. We have no examples of them more or less in general. But on the other hand, they start showing up in the 3rd century and really get quite numerous down to the 1st century BCE. We're looking forward to Charles Crowther's. So here's an example, on the other hand, of an institution which I don't believe is actually very well attested in the literary record. But again, here the case is where the beginning of the epigraphic record would also seem to be the beginning of the institution itself. So at any rate, that's just a kind of trying to expand kind of the base of what you said in your excellent paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Yeah.
And I was also trying to provoke Vincent Gabrielson to get into this.
Any remarks for the speakers or from Vincent Gabrielson?
May I say something now?
Yes.
Okay. Veronique, thank you very much for this very, very interesting overview. And of course, the subject is huge. One cannot go into every aspect of it. So I do not admire your position, and Andrzej too. But now I've been provoked more or less by Ed to enter into this discussion. But I think Veronique has already mentioned in connection with Delos, mentioned the fact that in addition to the political communities proper, in Delos we do have other communities that manifest themselves epigraphically. And so, I mean, this is not a neglect on part of Andrzej's and Veronique's side, but on the other hand, it is true that the public area begins to get not a rival, but a partner in this, the private actor that comes in, and these associations do imitate the democratic polis, and so their epigraphic habit and epigraphic output begins to increase during the upper and lower Hellenistic periods. Now, the interesting question is, and this is what John Davies also, I suppose, points at, the interesting question is whether the public and the private begin to compete about the epiphanestatos topos, which is very crucial in the epigraphic habit of the period. Everyone wants to have his or her inscriptions put on display on the epiphanestatos topos. I do have examples from Rhodes in the sanctuary of Electrona, in which the state that controls the sanctuary says, stop, no more inscriptions, that it is overcrowded. And then you have to make an aegesis, an application, to put an application with the Herodian authorities in order to get authorized to, to put up an inscription there. So there is a competition. But to stay with Rhodes, what we can see is that the epigraphic space expands with these private units, and it expands both within the city and into the necropolis. And these private units, they manifest themselves epigraphically. They litter the place, if I may say so, epigraphically, and they become a competitor or to the public epigraphic habit. So yes, to come back to Ed's comment or question, yes, the associations all over the Greek-speaking world become a new voice in this epigraphic world, and they have their own habits, and of course they imitate very much the public sphere. I do not know, Andrzej or Veronique or Andrzej has a comment on that, but
Yes, you're absolutely right, Vincent. It's very much visible. I wonder again if there is or not a Caesar in the low Hellenistic period for that, because in Attica, for instance, you have in the 4th century BC, there is a decree from decree from Sunion saying that there is no place anymore in the Agora because it's full with monuments, so we have to create a second Agora for market purposes because there is no place otherwise. It's a very interesting small text which shows that these epigraphic habits, this huge multiplication of inscriptions from the private sphere as from the public one, is developing continuously. And it's very visible in Asia Minor also, that you have small communities that are not cities, that are rural communities, slowly creating and adopting democratic forms coming from the polis. So this process of influence is really very visible, but it's maybe not a continuous process. It's appearing in some contexts that are coherent contexts, and evolution are not linear in that sense, but they're very visible in some places and some contact situations.
May I add just a little bit, Paschalis, this is the fact that, in the public sphere, there is more or less an obligation to publish documents and inscriptions. And again, our problem is that we cannot figure out the ratio between published text and unpublished text. I mean, that remain in Sanidae or in other perishable materials. But with the private associations, they do not have an obligation to do this thing. I mean, it is purely voluntary that they publish their own thing. And so we may suppose that they follow a greater current, a habit, and they exploit it to the limit sometimes. That was only that I wanted to remark. Thank you.
Yes.
You want? Oh, sorry. Yes.
I think that it's you're absolutely right, Vincent, to emphasize this difference. And here we have the evolution of an habit, because I really do think that in huge cities with public accounts, with a lot of decisions, documents, we have a kind of effect like open access in the epigraphy. I mean, it's very interesting for democratic communities to use epigraphy as a tool for open access, where people will be able to have access to read the documents, and they do not have to suffer asking permission to go to the archives and so on. It's in the public space, and it's exactly what we're calling now open access. But it's completely different for private association and for even private, for individuals that want to have for their reputation an access to the Epiphanes status topos. And this access is always passing through public acceptation, public authorization. So there is really a balance between both spheres of activities.
Could I come in here? Because I am working at the moment on the Athenian 6th century, and one of the main areas of documentation there is the Athenian Acropolis, with its hundreds of dedications, most of which are entirely private, to the point where it was only the Persian Wars that actually prevented the place from being absolutely overrun by a forest of private dedications, among which a few public dedications were totally lost. And that was a mania, I think, of self-projection by persons who wanted to show that they were important enough and rich enough to make dedications. And Alan Shapiro has expressed himself eloquently on this subject. And that seems to me actually to come back in a way to answer my own question of 10 minutes ago, because self-projection is not necessarily a different psychological process from civic self-projection in the way that one can see in precisely most of the public documents which we see all over the place. Thank you.
Yeah, but this situation in the archaic Acropolis, would it have been possible later on? I mean, my impression is that there is a strong domination of the state after the Persian War.
I think somebody after 480 put his foot down and said no more.
Yes.
It took time, but the general horizon is reckoned to be about 450, after which there are very, very few private dedications at all, mostly by Pan-Hellenic victors. So some regulation had to be imposed, as you were suggesting.
I jump in. I know I'm being rude to Christy right now. Christy, sorry about that. Just a brief remark that something similar as the Athenian Acropolis, a similar situation we have on Lindos, on the Acropolis of Lindos. It's overcrowded with dedicatory inscriptions. I mean, it's amazing. And it comes, I mean, these hotspots, the Epiphanestatos topos, these inscription on the hotspots, perhaps, I mean, reading the exact text does not matter greatly compared to the fact that you do post it in the Epiphanestatos topos, even though it's 5-6 meters high and nobody can read that thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Christy.
Before I give the digital floor to Christy, I think Paola Ceccarelli wanted to make a comment. I saw her hand. Ah, okay. So, Christy.
Thank you very much. In some ways, I think I'm going to continue what John asked, but not for the archaic period, but for the Hellenistic. And I love the way you unpacked change and the lack of change in the epigraphic record. I was just wanted to, if you could comment a bit on this link with democracy, not in the classical period, but in the Hellenistic period. And is it really helpful to talk about democratic preoccupations then, when I would say it's basically established political preoccupations? So by the Hellenistic period, it no longer matters how the epigraphic habit may or may not have originated. The publication has to do with deeply political concerns of the city-state. So in some ways, what John asked about the archaic period, in the archaic period, it's about personal concerns of self-publications that I would say are identical with political preoccupations, in the sense that elite preoccupations is synonymous in a way with political concerns. In the Hellenistic period, it's no longer about democracy, and it is perhaps misleading to talk about that, is rather than those procedures are deeply embedded into a broader understanding of how politics work.
Yes, but it's impressive to see that those groups are they are not able to consider themselves outside of the democratic process and decision-making process. So even if you have a group of association or small community that is not a city, people will express their decision in the form of the classical democracy. So we're not speaking about institutions here. We're speaking about form of expressions of the decision making, which is a big success of the model of the democratic Athenian institutions, in fact. Andrzej, maybe you want to have
No. I agree.
Vincent wants to add a comment. We cannot hear you.
Sorry, I just wanted to second Veronique because I just came to think of this inscription, the Athenian, well, it is not an Athenian inscription, it is a group of people from Sidon who puts up a decree in Athens, the Sidonians, and it's a bilingual inscription. Half the text is in Phoenician, and then a little bit of it, you know, at the end, to koinonton Sidonion is in Greek. And the translation of that text in Phoenician, I cannot read myself Phoenician, but Texidor has translated the text into French. And you see the Greek or the Athenian democratic vocabulary is exactly there, even though the text is in Phoenician. And these people are outsiders who have, you know, established themselves in Piraeus. Probably traders.
Another example can be quoted from the Jewish community in Josephus. We have this famous decree in honor of Simon, and one of the Maccabees. It is constructed exactly as if we are in a Greek democratic city, whereas we are in a institutionally speaking, in a completely different context. Yeah. So this is an influence of both of the formulae and of the way of thinking about the way the decision, community decisions have to be taken. And so it's a big success of, let's say, of the Athenian democracy model, because we find it in the 2nd century in a completely different place and in a completely different political and social context.
Pascal, may I add that the Copenhagen Association project has now completed its database with the Greek association from 500 BC to 300 AD, and we can see a pattern. I mean, most of these units are epigraphically attested, most of them. And one can, you know, you can go in and search into the organization and institutions they use, and you see the pattern is so clear throughout that they imitate the political institutions of their home communities. So far, there are over 1,200 associations attested of that. And remember, these are not units that they are obligated to put up inscriptions or do anything. I mean, in contrast to the polis, which is manifested itself, you know, by its own documents. These are private groups. Thank you.
There are no further questions. We are already, Edward, I think, just one last question. We are already 5 minutes into the break, supposedly, but okay, one last one.
Well, I'm going to make this very quick. The other thing is also the question of where inscriptions, especially public inscriptions, are displayed. And of course, in the earlier period, it's mainly, again, for Athens on the Acropolis. This changes a little bit. They get down to the Agora. One thing is with the changes in space, is that, first of all, you get many more stone theaters during the Hellenistic period. This is a new place to put public inscriptions. But the other thing, of course, is the creation of an elaborate kind of gymnasia. And gymnasia is a new space for this display. So this is to a certain extent also a change. I don't know if Veronique wants to, or Andrzej wants to quickly comment on that.
Yes, it's for Andrzej.
No. Would you please comment?
I mean, this. You mean, Edu? You mean the question of what Robert was referring to, the gymnasium as a new agora, which is in a way a little bit misunderstanding of Robert's words. In fact.
So yeah.
Yeah, Anders should answer that question.
It is a very famous sentence of Louis Robert about the gymnasium as a second agora of the Hellenistic city. But in fact, he was referring to a specific ritual, namely funeral ritual. So the reason he used this expression was that we have several Evergetae who are how to say burned in gymnasium, and they are called new. As Theodoros Pasparos is called new Kostas Tespoleos. So an honor which was used in the archaic times for oikistai, namely to be bashed in the agora, is now used for great Evergetae who are inhumated in gymnasium. But it does not mean that gymnasium is now the epiphanes status topos of a Hellenistic city. So, or that there's it's a public space in which assembly gathers and so on. So, I mean, the gymnasium becomes a place of exposure of decrees only as far as the gymnasium is concerned. I don't think, I think no public decree concerning other questions had ever been exposed in a gymnasium, as far as I remember. I don't know whether we agree or not.
Yes, I think also that it's an effect of the expansion of the epigraphy in general. But in gymnasia, I don't have the impression that in gymnasia you have specific public inscriptions. It's the corpus, the epigraphic corpus of the inscription fund in gymnasia are connected with the general society of the gymnasium, I think.
Epigraphy inevitably steers a lot of discussion, but unfortunately we're way behind schedule and we only have time for a short 5-minute break in order to regroup ourselves, and we'll reconvene at 11:45 with Paola Ceccarelli.
Thank you.
Νίκο, είσαι ακόμα εδώ, Νίκο?
Ναι, εδώ είμαι.
I will tell you an answer because I was thinking about your question, and I think what you showed yesterday in a brilliant way, that the assembly continues to be a place of debates and decision making, goes so counter to this change of epigraphic habit. Because if we don't have any decrees, if you are right, and I think you are, I mean, it's a big research project for this Greek city under the Roman rule is a huge project which is completely untouched, and I'm very pleased that this is a topic which is now more and more debated. But if you are right, if the assemblies of the Greek cities during the Roman imperial period continue to take decisions, it means that the change in epigraphic habit goes counter to the political and institutional reality.
Yeah, I understand your point. Now, yes.
Yeah, yeah. No, this. So because we cannot conclude that there were no more decrees or there were no more debate, and so we have to find another explanation, which I don't have, but yes, and it is an interesting case in which a change in the epigraphic habit does not bear witness of a political change.
This is what I'm thinking. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I want to have your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we do still have degrees, because if you have honorific inscriptions, the Boulé, the Demos, honor, so and so you do have degrees. Okay.
Yes.
However, a honorific degree speaks about democratic procedures. Okay, with enactment formulas. But mainly speak about the benefactor himself or herself.
Yeah.
And perhaps in a very verbalistic way, okay? But he displays the benefactor. The usual honorific inscription of the Roman period is a very short, very brief text. Okay, so for example, if you compare, I do that with my students. You know that better than me. This honorific decree from Eretria for Theopompos. Okay? So this is a very large text, all right? Displaying, demonstrating Theopompos' deeds in great detail. And inside the text, there is also the text of the honorific inscription, which has to be engraved on the statue base. Okay, and this is a very short text, just 4 lines. So I always tell my students, if we had only the honorific inscription, not the honorific decree, we wouldn't know anything about this donation. This is
also the case of Dodros Paschalis. We have of course. We and the honorific inscription quoted inside of the decree.
So my aporia, okay, my question is, how can we explain this? Because this seems to the absence of honorific decrees seems to downplay the contribution of the benefactor. Or we have to think that the contribution of the benefactor is now expressed in visual terms.
Yes, this is what
in terms of the statue.
Veronique suggested. Yes, this is maybe, and these statues are sometimes paid by the benefactors themselves, as we know from some attestation when it is said explicitly that he is going to take the cost of the statue, which is voted for him. So he negotiates with the community, give me a statue, I will pay it because I want to have a statue exposed in a public place. Yeah. But if we are right, it means that it would mean that the societies of the communities of the Roman imperial period, Greek communities, were not more interested in reading inscriptions or learning something from the text. It's a very dangerous conclusion. So if they are becoming illiterate or interested only in visual culture, there's something cultural which is very interesting behind this process. We touched upon, but it's something very new, I think, in research.
But certainly, people were more interested in looking at the picture as a portrait of the benefactor than in the last centuries.
But I mean, why
that was created by this new habit.
But why were they used to to look at very long inscriptions like this of Ptolemaios and Menippos from Corinth, which is a huge text, and then all of a sudden they won't just have a statue of this man, and it's not important for them to have a text. I don't know why. I don't know. It's a Paschalis, yeah?
I think it's time to turn to the literary sources now because it's already 11:46.
Okay. So,
and I'm sure we can continue later or in another break. Our next speaker is Paola Ceccarelli from the University City College of London, a well-known specialist in classical and Hellenistic historiography, epistolography, antiquarianism, and cultural history, to mention only the topics on which she has written or co-edited books. Her talk today will offer us an overview of what change means and why change occurs in the literary sources. Paola.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yes, okay. So let me also start to share my very, very short PowerPoint, but just to facilitate following. Voila. Yeah, is it okay? Yeah. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers. It is a great pleasure to be here and to be able to join you in honoring the work of John Davies. I was tasked with discussing change in literary sources, and even a very cursory glance at ancient Greek literature shows a bewildering diversity of genres, of contexts, of places. So if we focus on poetry and follow a broad chronological line, we have epic poetry from Homer to Apollonius to Quintus of Smyrna, Nonnus, without counting the lost authors, Querylos of Samos. We may look at iambic and elegiac poetry with a production particularly high in the Archaic period, but both genres continued to be productive in very different ways, and one may think of the iamboy of Callimachus, which are explicitly linked to the earlier tradition, for instance, with the revenant Hipponax, but which are also so different. Then lyric poetry and 5th century tragedy, comedy, satyr play. Similarly, for prose, we have texts of a philosophical or historical nature from the 6th century BC onwards, medical texts, oratory. Although the corpus we have comes exclusively from Athens, speeches were obviously held everywhere in Greek polis, and we hear reflections of this in the openings of royal letters and city decrees, mentioning the arrival and presentation by ambassadors. And then we have works such as Athenaeus' De Hypnosophiste, which on the one hand inscribe themselves in a sympathetic tradition that goes back to Plato, but were invested on the other hand in a reinscription of Greek literary production within this tradition, and very obviously are the product of a culture of the written word, the library. And all of this takes place in different locations too, from the coast of Asia Minor or Sparta to Sicily to Athens to Alexandria, to mention just some obvious places. Places which had a different cultural traditions which impacted on both production, performance, and reception. A speech that would work nicely in Athens might be a disaster in Sparta, as Herodotus points out. So there is definitely diversity, which in itself need not imply change if you view change as a process. But there are also issues of transmission and survival. There is in particular one huge, much discussed factor of change, which is writing and its diffusion in the Greek world. This is a phenomenon that has an obvious impact on the production and consumption of literature, but it goes hand in hand with a number of questions on the degree to which literacy was widespread. Now, before I get stuck into details, I would like to unpack the title of my paper, Change in the Literary Sources. First, this cannot help but raise the question of what is meant by literary. At the very least, and very schematically, we ought to distinguish two basic meanings of the term. On the one hand, literary refers to a specific type of evidence or source that is written text, generally and comprehensively conceived, as opposed to, say, archaeological data that does not contain any writing. And then there are, of course, things such as inscriptions or graffiti, where those categories of literary and archaeological or material blur in very interesting ways. On the other hand, literary refers to a subcategory of written data that is text of fragments that exhibit a certain form, quality, or marked style that sets them apart from writings that lack these features. Now, these features render them special to the point that cultures decide to invest in their preservation and continual reuse, which generates the phenomenon of literary traditions. And here I am revisiting very well-known territory. The status, function, and value of such literary texts in and for the field of ancient history have been the subject of long-standing and ongoing controversies. And here I touch on the second part of the title, sources, and how we look at them. And Marek's paper yesterday had something to say on that. So already in 1980, Nicole Leroux, in her paper Thucydide n'est pas un collègue, pointed out how her French colleagues, who came from institutions where there was a strict division between historians and classicists, tended to look at literary texts either as documents or as monuments. The former refers to their use as source material, often in the naive assumption that these texts give us more or less unmediated access to a period in history and exist there for the benefit of the modern historians who can just use the information contained within them to create their own narratives about the ancient world. By contrast, the monumental approach to literary texts treats them as cultural objects to be admired and respected as artifacts in their own right, artifacts calling for a kind of studied appreciation and analysis which does not require much, if any, reference to their wider historical context. Leroux concluded their discussion by insisting that neither approach on its own is satisfactory. What historians need to do is to treat literary texts as both documents and monuments, or to put it differently, assess their referential value while bearing in mind the complicating factors that come with their status as creative, verbal artifacts inserted in and part of a tradition. Leroux's article of 1980 captured a trend in classical scholarship that would come fully into its own in the decades since. Put very briefly and again very schematically, in the wake of new historicism and other advances in critical thinking, literary scholars learn to treat their monuments also as documents, and historians learn to treat what they would like to regard as primarily documents also as monuments. In this paradigm, the concept of literary source, as traditionally understood, needs to be reconfigured to take into account its textual monumental dimension. So in what follows, I shall use text and source interchangeably. And I shall throughout presuppose the unmarked comprehensive understanding of literary. Now, in what follows, I want to offer some reflection on what discussing change in literary text might mean, what stories of change our literary sources give rise to, how we may account for them, and how they may feed into more strictly historical research agendas. To start with, I offer some reflections on the consequences of the by now prevailing scholarly paradigm, putting equal emphasis on what we have gained and what we have lost through its rise to dominance. Secondly, I want to illustrate with reference to some text cases what plausible stories about change nowadays look like, to me at any rate. I shall conclude by asking what such stories are actually good for. And this approach may strike you as a bit heavy meta, but some degree of self-reflection has by now become a prerequisite of the stories that we tell about the ancient world, in particular those that want to address such fundamental categories of historical analysis, such as change. So change, some would like to call it progress in scholarship, is always a story of loss and gain at the same time. Thus, if one revisits the literary histories of the 19th and early 20th centuries and considers their way of presenting and accounting for the surviving evidence, we may diagnose a significant loss in what in hindsight looked like methodological and theoretical naivete. This naivete enabled scholars to do things with our data that we no longer consider plausible. take the case of literary history, a topic that has been much discussed since the mid-20th century, and most recently in connection with ancient Greek literature in a collective volume edited by Jonas Kretlein and Antonios Rengakos, Griechische Literaturgeschichtschreibung, so histories of literature, and specifically histories of ancient literature, start only at the end of the 18th century in the wake of Winkelmann. And Kassel, among others, has traced a very precise genealogy of the genre. First, there was simply an absence, or at best, a very practical organizational structure, such as the one adopted by Vossius in his De Veterum Poetarum Temporibus, which appeared posthumously in Amsterdam in 1654. Then Wolff, in his introductory lectures in Halle, so at the very end of the 18th century, divided Greek literature into epochs, which were, however, initially meant simply as an aid for the learner. But once the division into epochs had taken root, scholars began to haggle over fitting the data into established system of classification, and moreover imposed the pattern of organic growth and decline upon the sequence of epochs. And throughout the 19th century, the writing of histories of Greek and Latin literature boomed according to this model. Still in 1897, Gosse, in his general editor's introduction to Murray's History of Ancient Greek Literature, had no doubts. A great point will be made, it is hoped, by dwelling on the actions, the counter-influences of literatures on one another in the course of the revolution, and by noting what appears to be the causes which have led to a revival here and to decline there. In short, we shall neglect no indication of change, of development in an adult literature, and our endeavor will be to make each volume a well-proportioned biography of the intellectual life of a race, treated as a single entry. Lots of scary things here. Literature is here viewed as something organic, of which one can write a biography. This historicist approach entered into crisis already at the beginning of the 20th century. If earlier generations like to believe that our surviving literary sources contain within themselves a coherent history along the organic metaphor of rise, flowering, and decline, in line with the conventional period labels of archaic, classical, and Hellenistic, we have since become wary of thus plotting literary history. Various considerations, some practical, some theoretical, militate against such narratives of change. Most of the literary texts that have come down to us are the result of deliberate selections made according to criteria that do not necessarily align with our own modern heuristic interests. And the resulting canons have in turn been subject to random accidents of transmission, further skewing the historical record to which we still have access. The cult of the fragment, of scrounging around for any scrap of data, is one consequence of the realization of how severely compromised our evidence truly is for the kind of stories we once liked to tell. But even the massive investment in rendering the fragmentary material accessible and relevant hardly remedies the problem. Thus, in an article published in 1977, Umblick in Trümmerfelder Griechischen Geschichtsschreibung, Hermann Strasburger pointed out that of the entire Greek historiographical production, only a minimal part, corresponding on a conservative estimate to about 1/40, has survived. The consequence he drew from this was that anyone wanting to understand Greek historiography as a whole, the development of the genre in various directions, and ultimately the Greek understanding of the notion of history as discursively articulated, could not rely only on those authors preserved in their entirety or almost, and that it was necessary to consider the fragments. But his next step was to show just how tricky and how misleading fragments can be for the interpreter. Perhaps even more damaging to the traditional genre of literary history than the unpredictability of a canonizing selection and then its partial undoing through accidents in transmission has been the gradual disintegration of reified entities such as literature, or even genre that are essential for plotting narratives of change. Scholars of archaic Greece in particular have become wary of endowing genres with a transhistorical core, emphasizing instead the importance of social settings and occasions, and such an emphasis on context inevitably complicates the writing of literary history. Yet, even if texts live in different performance contexts and reach slightly different audiences, they are certainly not isolated from each other. Tragedies respond to other tragedies, but also to comedy, epic poetry, developments in prose, and more generally, events. In terms of audience, participants to a symposium would also be steeped in Homeric poetry, and so on. All of this challenges certain ideas of unity, certain reifications that inform literary history, and complicates the question of what kind of change and change of what exactly we are tracking. So to sum up this opening part, changes in scholarly approaches, both in theory and methodology, have rendered certain interpretative moves difficult, if not impossible. What has been gained from the point of view of scientific progress, we are now operating at a greater degree of sophistication and complexity in our understanding of what we can and cannot do on the basis of the available evidence. This applies in particular to causalities, which are very difficult to construct, should we even want to construct them, and involve various factors and forces, and most likely an entire set of unknown variables and speculative moves. Also importantly, we have learned to read verbal artifacts as media of communication and reflections, which a culture uses to generate the imaginary world in which they live and to construct, mediate, and negotiate reality. Literature is not only the product of a person activity, of an age, of a sensibility, it also influences history, it impacts on audiences. New historicism in particular has emphasized the reciprocal interaction between history and literature. So these texts become documentary in ways hitherto unappreciated. So change implies the transformation of a specific unit over time, but this can take various forms, various degrees of continuity or discontinuity, from modest modifications to radical ruptures. Scale and granularity are important. When we look for change in our literary sources, all the various aspects that make up this particular type of data may come into focus: rhythm, choice of words, choice of literary dialect and language, genre or performance context, choice of topics, and it also matters what chronological and geographical remit we impose upon the investigation. So what may look like one type of change at the micro level may well look like a different kind of change in a broader canvas. So in what follows, I will go through some example of specific loci of change, and then I'll step back for a conclusion. So I would like to begin by focusing on poetry, and specifically on an aspect of poetry that we as historians often tend to overlook: meter, the structure of versification. Here, change can be described with a fairly high degree of precision based on statistical analysis. Let's take the example of the resolution in tragic iambic trimeters, that is the tendency to replace a long syllable in a princeps position with two shorts. The pattern of resolutions has been used in particular for Euripides because of the number of plays preserved, which provide a relatively large statistical base, although a problem is that few of these plays are securely dated. Nonetheless, a trend has been detected towards a greater relaxation in the iambic trimeters. The earlier plays, down to the Hippolytus, show percentages similar to the overall Sophoclean one of about 5.4%. So here we are in 428 BC. But after that, there is a very marked increase in resolutions, up to about 38% in the Orestes of 408 BC. Indeed, according to some interpreters, Euripides' evolving metrical practice is the most helpful criterion for establishing the relative chronology of his undated plays. So how are we to explain this change? Importantly, these resolutions occur in the iambic trimeter, which is supposed to mirror normal speech and which is spoken. as Devine and Stephens have emphasized, we are not simply facing a process of metrical relaxation, rather these features correlate with features of everyday speech, in particular rapid informal speech. Arguably then, the increase in resolution within iambic trimeters is a conscious attempt on the part of Euripides to render his discourse more in tune with ordinary language use, to make it sound more mimetic or naturalistic. My point here is that we can't trace changes within an author at the level of the rhythm, an author whose career covered a remarkably large span, but still an individual. We can also correlate a change in the versification of the iambic trimeters and tetrameters to a feature of spoken language. But this is change within an author, an individual. Similar criteria can be applied to larger units of analysis. So if we take the category everything written in hexameter and make allowances for some outliers, we can build a general picture of how the hexameter looked at any given time, and this will help attributing some particular meaning or special characteristics to the outliers. Furthermore, if we can trace a series of modifications, we can then try to look into change as a process rather than just an event or an authorial decision. So our challenge as historians at this level would be to relate changes in the language of specific text, authors, to a larger system beyond individual choices, and this both at the level of the langue and at the level of genre viewed as a system, which is where I am moving next. So alternatively, we may want to track change at the level of genre, both within a specific genre and across genres. To put it differently, to trace the way in which one type of performance takes over or even supplants an earlier form. I'm going to focus for the moment on this second aspect. It is immediately evident that some types of literature, and this applies to both poetry and prose, are more popular, or at any rate appear to have been more popular and to have attracted more practitioners at different moments in time. Thus, even if we account for issues of transmission, it is quite clear that Epinician poetry, as represented for us by the works of Simonides, Pindar, and Bacchylides, seems to have been a form of poetic expression limited to a specific moment in time, the 6th and especially the 5th centuries. The last Epinician ode surviving in fragments is the one attributed to Euripides, praising Alcibiades for his equestrian victories of 416. Epinician functioned in a specific context and not just chronological, also geographical, as even taking into account issues of transmission, some geographical areas of the ancient Greek world seem to have privileged that particular event, poetic form over others. But of course, victors continued to win at Olympia, Delphi, and elsewhere, actually even more as there were more and more festivals. And their victories were celebrated at home, for instance, receiving special privileges. But at any rate, at the level of literary sources, we do not hear of later Epinicians, and in the Hellenistic period, we see these victories being celebrated with epigrams, or in the case of Callimachus, with which is a special case, with elegiac poems, poems in elegiac couplets. In particular, I'm thinking of the Victoria Berenices, which celebrates a woman winner, so a huge change. We had only male winner until then. Kiniska was the first one, but celebrating a Nemean victory obtained between 246 and 243 BC by the wife of Ptolemy III, Berenice from Cyrene. Now, this is the first extensive Epinician for a woman. It is defined explicitly as Epinicion by Callimachus in verse 3, and actually verse 1 mirrors quite closely the beginning of Pindar's Nemean one. This was a Nemean victory. But it was part of the frame of the Book of the Aetia, although it may have circulated separately. So this is one example, and the epigrams of Poseidippos are the other example of celebrations of victory, which take the place of what we now call Epinicion, that wouldn't have been its name in the 5th century, for the Ptolemaic queens, in the case of many of Poseidippos ones. So we see a change, And in this particular case, it is a change from one form of celebration, which implied a chorus and lyric song, then a comus and specific rules for praise, including the reintegration of the victor among the citizens, to a different form, much shorter, less involved in the life of the civic community, and celebrating, among others, royal women. Of course, this form, the short epigram, existed already at the time in which Pindar produced his epinicians. Simonides composed both epigrams and epinicians, but they had a different, more specific focus. Furthermore, epigram carries in itself the implication of physical inscription on marble on the basis of a statue, ideally. It is thus a form which is mostly assumed to have meant for reading, whether in situ or in a book. The habit of compiling anthologies of epigrams begins already in the late 5th century and comes fully into its own in the Hellenistic period, a process traced by Andrzej Petrovich. Eventually, we find that we have, as it were, changed genre, changed the context of performance, but not the cultural practice of immortalizing victors at the games in literary discourse. And this transformation of preferences is something that can be related to a change in the society who produced and consumed these genres. Another place where we can observe change within our literary sources is in the shift in meaning that some significant terms undergo. As Cerroni points out in a study focused on algos, some words thrive in literary language for a certain period of time, then progressively fade until they completely disappear. Others gradually establish themselves from very humble origins to become prestigious even in the most refined literature. The reasons for this are manifold and are sometimes difficult, if not impossible, to assess. End of quote. But for some terms, it is possible to relate the shift to a change in historical context with very interesting results. For instance, Daniel Allen has pointed to the sudden appearance of the term prohairesis, a term whose meaning ranges from choice with a number of qualifiers such as moral or deliberate, to commitment to moral purpose and even will. So a change of this term in the text of the Attic orators. She has linked the appearance of this term, the sudden appearance in the orators, to a series of lectures on rhetoric given by Aristotle in the mid-350s BCE. Now, this is an instance of the influence exerted by one author text on contemporaries and later audiences. But Allen has further proposed to link the appearance and the take of this new term, because it's not enough to have a new term, it has to take, to conceptual shifts in discourses about the display of excellence and recognition of honor on the one hand, and what she calls new technologies of power on the other, in particularly the primacy of speech over military power in the leadership of Athens in the late 5th century BCE. Now, studies tracking this type of change are numerous. In a recent collective volume aptly titled Parole in Movimento, Paschalis Paschidis has followed the variations in the meaning of philia, while Paola Lombardi has focused on diathesis. Philotimia, mentioned by Manuela Mari just 2 days ago, is another illuminating case in point. In all of these cases, it is possible to link conceptual shifts to changes in society. The uses of philia were extended to cover the asymmetrical friendship between kings and the polis, and the court of Antiochus III may have been responsible for the semantic shift from the initial rather vague meaning of diathesis, arrangement, to a specific one of disposition of the city towards the king and vice versa. One final example, and this is rather change in media, from my own work on epistolary communication. The Mediterranean was always an interconnected, networked world, but Polybius's work testifies to a change in the quality as well as in the intensity of contact. In his day and age, almost everyone is in the business of sending letters, and written documents, be they authentic or falsified, acquire a particular importance, while the lack of letters or of other written document may be used as an excuse to refuse to engage in diplomatic dialogue. But even more striking than this or that Polybian instance of the use or non-use of a written document is the change in terminology. As Wolbank has shown, the use of diasafeo to show clearly, specifically with reference to written document, is typical of Polybius. But this habit is part of a larger change. Herodotus and Thucydides speak of angeloi, messengers, and you have the numbers there, as well as of kerukes, heralds. Moreover, Thucydides has 122 examples of presbeutai, while Herodotus one single case, so this is interesting too. There are still ambassadors, presbes in Polybius and in very high numbers, but the occasional messengers, the angeloi and their messages, angeliae, have all but disappeared. Instead, there is now a new term for messengers, grammatophoroi, letter or document carriers, first attested in Polybius, and not so much used even afterwards. It is, for instance, absent in Diodorus. Similarly, from now onwards, bibliophoroi, document carriers, begin to appear in a limited way in Polybius, only 2 instances in what we have of him, but more importantly in Diodorus, as well as in official documents and relatively numerous papyri. Diodorus uses this term when recounting events during the Persian Wars. In his account, cavalrymen come from the countryside, bringing to Gelon of Syracuse a letter carrier, a bibliophoros, who was conveying dispatches from the people of Selinus. We are in 480 BC. And at the arrival of Mardonius in 479, before the Battle of Plataea, Diodorus' Athenians sent bibliophoroi to the Spartans, asking for their help. But there is no trace of bibliophoroi in either Herodotus or Thucydides. Here, and in so many other instances, Diodorus is retrojecting contemporary linguistic habits on the past. So the change in terminology clearly reflects a wider change within society, a change in technology of communication, and we have to deal with the fact that these languages change when assessing what's going on. Finally, change in the choice of themes treated of topics. Now, this is a kind of change which I find particularly difficult to trace, and it seems to me that it can be fruitfully discussed only within genres. And comedy offers a good example from moving from the early variants of Märchenkomödie or mythological comedy, as reconstructed with a reasonably degree of likelihood from the fragments, to Aristophanic comedy, to 4th century comedy, to Menander. Notwithstanding the problems caused by the fact that we have only fragments of the comic poets preceding and following Aristophanes, the historical evolution of the genre can nonetheless be traced, at least in outline, both at the formal level, so disappearance of the choruses and the epirematica gone, difference in modes of versification and language use, and at the level of the themes and characters present in the plays. As historians, we can relate the plays to their social and historical contexts. For instance, the many 5th century comedies whose plot revolves around the motif of the automatos bios, a life of ease in which there is no need to work and everything flocks to Athens miraculously, such as the Metalleis or the Persai of Pherecrates. These plays can be interpreted as the comic version of the Periclean ideology of Athens being able to import everything with ease through the control of the sea. The heyday of this motif lasts for some 20 years or so. When the motif comes up afterwards, it is rather as part of a tradition. We do not know much of Middle Comedy, but riddles, courtesans, and cooks certainly play a significant role, together with allusion to significant politicians, a bit in the mold of comedy dear, old comedy. In Menander, plots tend to revolve around lost girls, courtesan, braggart soldiers, peasants, and young men. We do not have any names, but as Susan Leip has shown, the interface between comedy and contemporary politics is still very much alive, but it is articulated differently. This genre then offers a good illustration of the possibilities, but also of the difficulties to trace and, more importantly, explain literary change. It also illustrates well the difficulties with periodization. In terms of literary formal history, this is comedy, and it stands in a line of continuity, notwithstanding the changes, with 5th century comedy. And yet, the usual periodization tends to put Menander in the Hellenistic literature bracket for reasons that are quite understandable. Given the then manifold textual and contextual variables and the determining influence of evolving sociopolitical parameters that shape the production of comic drama in ancient Athens, it might be advisable to speak of kaleidoscopic configurations that shift often unpredictably over time as being a more adequate metaphor to capture the complexity of historical data than the reassuring notion of change with its inbuilt assumption of stability, continuity, and predictability. So the notion of the kaleidoscope sets up my conclusion. Things change in our literary source and elsewhere on various levels and in myriad ways and for manifold reasons. Nothing is easier than to diagnose change. It requires a simple exercise of compare and contrast, but you diagnose it at different levels. To explain change plausibly, even at the individual levels, is much harder, especially given the state of our evidence, and almost inevitably it involves simplifications. As historians, change is our métier, and we like narratives that cohere, that tell a story and that feature a plot, and this is fine. In my paper, I've given instances of changes of various types remaining at the micro level, as it were. But I wonder about the plausibility of grand narratives of change and whether we should not maybe seek to develop an analytic idiom less fraught with preconceptions than the notion of change, such as differentiation, diversification, and evolution, or indeed the random reconfigurations one gets when shaking a kaleidoscope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola, for this kaleidoscopic, as you quite rightly termed it, overview of change in the literary sources. Now we have time for discussion. Remember, panelists and attendees alike to raise your hands so I can see who wants to ask a question or make a comment. Hans.
Yes, thanks very much. Thank you very much, Paola. Really tackling this extremely difficult challenge so well. I think to me, it seemed like you had the hardest brief of all of us to try and encompass all those developments. I wondered that right at the end you addressed this issue of explaining change and raising the question as to what kind of change we're really talking about. That struck me as an interesting approach. So differentiation is one of the terms you used, and I was wondering if you if you thought that was indeed going beyond the kaleidoscopic image, but if we push beyond that, whether differentiation is in literature, as in I think in quite a few other fields, a useful type of change to apply, and B, perhaps also the old question as to what extent are we looking for the dynamics of change within, as it were, within the genres or within the material that you're looking at, and to what extent are we looking outside in social, political, economic change, for that matter, whether there's any way of making those links, or whether the internal dynamics are really what it's all about.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, now I remember the second, but I have lost the first one. Yes, so differentiation. Well, what I had in mind was something a bit like those maps that Moretti has, where they plot on landscape. I mean, his view I was struck by some similarities between the way they explain the evolution of European literatures from the Baroque period onwards and the Greek world. The idea there is that you have a system of independent states, each one with a slightly, well, they have different languages to begin with, but all brought together by the unique tradition that goes back to Christianity on the one hand and classical tradition to the other. So you have a kind of diversity and unity and space and interaction. And he argued that that was the frame within which a number of further developments came up. And I was struck by the fact that for Greek literature, indeed, you have different places that specialize, if you want, in some areas, and then, of course, change and some things die and so on and so forth, but you don't find the same. And after a while, of course, forms start to circulate and to get common, but again, up to a point. So you have a competition between different areas. In the Hellenistic periods, you know, it's Alexandria, of course, and we've lost the Seleucid materials, but very recently now, what's her name? Marine something has argued, others have argued for a Seleucid specific view and an important Seleucid literature that has gone lost. Pergamon is the other place. So, differentiation rather in that sense, I thought. And my problem really was with levels of scale, how close and how far away you go for your narratives. And that's going to impact massively on the kind of pictures that you're going to have. Now, for the other question about the connections with the social, there I think that we, you know, it is messy. Of course, certainly there are. I mean, with comedy, I can point at situations where there are connections, and it's rather obvious. But they don't move potentially pari passu, all of these changes. I mean, what I really liked about the paper of Veronique and Andrzej was that a change in style, which is quite marked, what impressed you, this Ampolus and so on, doesn't necessarily correspond to a change in institutions or in society. And here with literary texts, you have a similar situation at a more complex degree. So there again, there are ways that you can construct maps of how social situations work within literary text, and then you could try to compare them with your mappings outside. You shouldn't necessarily expect changes exactly to move in the same way, but I don't know. I don't know if this is an attempted answer.
I think I saw Marek's hand raised, but now it's now, yes. Marek Kostas.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Paola, for this paper, wonderful paper. Practically, our problem is also that in some clusters of what we do, we naturally prioritize change or differentiation, like intellectual history, what the broad umbrella intellectual history. Whereas in many other clusters, we rather prioritize continuity. So it's not only the problem of relating, say, literary history with social history, but also the problem of the optics we are given by our intellectual habits. And this is, to me, one of the most important challenges on the verge of between, say, literature and history of literature, and how we use it for historical broad or small historical reconstructions.
Yes, actually, one of my problem was indeed with this problem of continuity and change. I mean, change, I suppose one can understand change in various ways, but I took it to mean a process where you have a duration in time. Otherwise, it would be a fissure, a rupture, whatever. And again, I wonder, some instruments that we use are more attuned to perceiving continuities and others ruptures. And well, with literary text, you're a bit in between, but again, yesterday, listening to Christy, I was thinking about microhistory as something that for me is more helpful if I want to get really close to things than trying to get long spans, because I will just be hampered by so many issues there of availability of sources, as I said, but also they do come from the same. So look, I wanted, for instance, to talk about Pyrrhic today, because that is something that I know. Now, the trouble is that for Pyrrhic, I couldn't, because there isn't any surviving text that I can say, this is a literary text, it's a Pyrrhic, okay? We just know from it from the outside entirely. Now, from the outside, what I see is that it changed quite a lot, because it was performed in different contexts. So I can't even say that it changed. I can say that the context of performance changed quite a lot. Whatever it was, I don't know, because I don't have the thing. So that's why I didn't go there. But it is really complicated to put the two together.
Two questions from attendees. The first one from John Knight, if Katerina is kind enough to.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
You can
Hello.
speak.
Hi.
You can
Hi,
speak.
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Thank you for it was an excellent paper, Paola, very thought-provoking. I'm just kind of wondering, on the micro scale, I was thinking about the point you made about the way motifs can be used to show change and different motifs being used at different times. I wondered if you would share your opinion on how profitable you think it is to analyse changes in characterizations of, say, historical figures. Someone like Periander comes to mind, who we have a tradition as one of the 7 sages, but then an alternative tradition in Herodotus where he's kind of seen as being a bloodthirsty tyrant type of character. I just wonder if you think that that's a useful way of kind of analysing change over time and in different genres.
Okay, thank you. Yes. I mean, if a particular character is viewed in different ways at different moments, it depends who you're looking at. But if you take your I mean, it does mean that the perception that your two sources at different times have of the same person have shifted for some reasons. And if you assume that the second one is aware of the first one, then of course, yes, definitely it reflects some difference at the lower end. Of course, we're within a tradition. So one assumes that whoever comes after knows whatever has been going on. And if they change position, there has to be some reason for this change of position. The problem is to what you're going to attribute this change. Desire for innovation, competition. Competition is another term that I haven't used much, but that fits very much into all of the Greek literary landscape. Or indeed a societal change that makes it be now that actually you do consider the person differently. Now, Periander is rather odd because indeed the lower you go, the more it gets like a wise man. All this tradition about these wise men and how they get up. There I don't have a specific answer, but I take your point. Yes, thank you.
Oh, thanks.
We also have a question by Stephen Hodginson.
I
think we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Well, since this is the first occasion on which I've spoken, can I first of all start by congratulating John on his honorary degree and the organisers on organising such a marvellous event in John's honour. It's very well deserved, John. Thank you, Paola, for such a stimulating paper. And the question I have touches upon the issue that Hans raised in general terms about how we explain literary change, whether it's internal or in terms of wider social practices. And I was very struck by your discussion of the change from epinikion to epigram. And you briefly mentioned that epigram is, of course, associated with inscriptions on monuments. And I wonder whether this is a phenomenon that's worth bringing out more fully. I came across it myself some years ago when I was looking at Spartan celebrations of Olympic success. And with one exception, possible exception, the Spartans don't have epinikia, but they do have many victory statues and other monumental celebrations. One of which, of course, the celebration of Kiniska bears an epigram, which then makes its way into the literary texts. So I wonder here whether it's the case that we can't isolate literary evidence itself. We have to look at the wider social practices. We have to look, in this case, into material culture as well. And therefore, I'd be interested in your reflections on how the different types of evidence, literary, epigraphic, archaeological, interact in facilitating, bringing about change in literary genres.
Sorry, thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. The thing with epinician, let's continue to call it epinician, is that indeed it's a song performed by a chorus of people for the winner. And there is this change which is marked, and which you're absolutely right. The moment you move to epigram, you imply the statue as well. And so you imply another permanence. Actually, part of this drift was implied into Epinician itself in the comparison that they make to the advantage of Epinician poetry, of course, with monuments. You know, there is the guy who does the statues, but I'm doing something better. So there is this kind of move, I agree, from what was a poetic form that possibly just ended, you know, for 16, it's close to the new music. Maybe it was just a different kind of approach. And because in Nuce, the comparison had already been there, because already earlier you could choose, after all, whether you wanted both a monument and, as has been said, some people went for the double, you know. I mean, after all, the Syracusan tyrants do have also their monuments, not just the Epinicians. So you can trace indeed changes at the literary level and at the social level, but I would be hard put to indicate exactly a moment when you decide that actually a statue is, but maybe it's also my ignorance, but it is clear, I entirely agree that you have to take into consideration the desire of having a different kind of permanence to the one that you get with song, and then that other one is the essential one, and you just move to shorter poems that will maybe circulate more, because as you point out, the Kiniska epigram then enters also in the literary tradition, in the anthology and so on. So I don't know. I find this, you see, you can grapple with interactions if you look at them closely. So if you limit your field. So for that particular case, you can really trace it. And if one were to put in the work, probably one could measure it, how it would relate to changes at other levels or in other area that happen in the same period, that would be much more complicated. I'm sorry, it's really a very bad answer, but it's the complication of things.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Edward.
Good, thank you, Paola, very much for that. And I agree with Hans. You've been given perhaps the most difficult brief. What I want to do is just also kind of expand this kind of notion of literature. Our ideas of literature are very much kind of conditioned by our kind of modern ideas of literature, and we tend to think of, say, the novel, we tend to think of poetry. But there is another also aspect of literature, which is the technical literature, which is, for instance, and I think which also can be linked to economic and kind of social developments. And I just want to give two examples. First of all, the works of doctors. With Hippocrates, the doctors start writing. And then, of course, this continues down into the Hellenistic period with Herophilus and also Erasistratus, who begin to write. And it also, again, culminates with Galen, who I remember hearing one place is saying that there's more works of Galen actually preserved than any other author from antiquity. It's really quite stunning. And Harry Pleckett, now on the one hand, to what extent is this an attempt to hand down information? But Harry Pleckett has come up with another suggestion. The literature is also a way of kind of promoting one's status. And this is therefore a kind of a reflection of the higher status of doctors, and I would also say certain levels of kind of very highly skilled labor in the Hellenistic period. And we know, for instance, from Samama's collection, that doctors in this period are not just working, but they're also receiving a lot of honorary decrees. And also putting that together, also the architects. The architects start also having a kind of a technical literature, and other craftsmen, also high status craftsmen, do this. And that seems to be, but I was wondering if you could probably just kind of add that actually to what was otherwise an excellent presentation.
Yes, I have no problems in adding that. Indeed, it is something that also you can correlate, but I would also add that we, as I said at the beginning, we've got to deal with canonization, which doesn't happen only, you know, with the Alexandrians and so on, but there are various moments, and with accidents of transmission, which further complicate the issue, you know, because what may seem to us extraordinary sometimes turns out to be a lucky find. We're helped, of course, because one can check how many manuscripts of someone and where they come from. So you can, up to a point, assess how much something circulated. And indeed, it's true that they do receive lots of honors and that there is a transmission of things. Doctors are important in society, but the extraordinary preeminence of Galen, yes, it's, yeah, perplexing if you want. And the lack or I mean, you know, it depends on what they wanted to preserve potentially. But thank you. Yes, it's. I mean, I really do agree on the main point. I wasn't. I mean, maybe I came across as too nihilistic. There are quite a few possibilities, and I'm trying to do that myself. You know, of course, as I said, with comedy, you do have moments too when you can really correlate whatever is going on in what we receive as text, but what's going on the scene, and the society that was looking at them. And we see that this text impact potentially, well, we don't see it, but we have to assume that they impacted as well on the society who was consuming them. So of course, definitely. My problem is how you bring it all together in a long duration, and then you will have to simplify enormously.
Andrzej?
Yes, okay. Paola, thank you very much. I was very pleased to learn that we are not more obliged to explain the comedy of Meanders as a kind of witness of the death of Polis, what used to be a previous interpretation, and this focus on the private things was always interpreted as the sign that the Athenians of the time of Menanders had no more interest in the public affairs, which was connected with or the whole interpretation of the political history. And today it's we know that it's completely absurd, because the Athenians of the time of Menander was so interested, as much interested in the public things as the Athenians of the Aristophanes. So the change is not in the attitude towards the public things, but the change is in the comedy style, or the interest of the poet, who is interested in other things than Aristophanes. But you just, it's a technical question, you alluded to a book about Menander, which I ignore, and I would like to read. So would you please repeat the name of the author of this book on Menander?
Yes, it's Susan Leip. Shall I put it in the chat maybe?
Yes, would you please?
But if you Google Susan Leip, and then I think Reproducing the City, that should be the title.
Okay. Okay.
You don't want to go
you
whole
can send
straight,
me
but some parts of it really make
okay.
the book.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? No digital hands and no actual hands. So I think we can have a short break now, unless Katerina wants to add something.
I only wanted to add that I will shortly be putting adding the address for the Padlet for you to check if you want to exchange views, because I don't think you can attach documents to chat here. You can't attach documents to chat if you want to send anything.
I will send a message directly to Paola. So
yeah. Okay.
Address, so that's not okay.
Okay, so we reconvene at 1:15 with Robin Osborne and the material culture. Until then, enjoy your coffee, everyone. Thank you very much to all speakers and participants in the discussion.
11?
1:15.
1:15. Half an hour.
Yes, less than half an hour now.
Okay.
Okay. If that's okay with you, we can start, I think. Well, I am very pleased and honored. It's a great pleasure and honor to have with us in this afternoon, in this late morning session, Professor Robin Osborne. Professor Robin Osborne is the person who does not require any introduction. He's a prominent professor of ancient classics and ancient history with a very impressive publication record, publishing nearly a book a year, every year, more or less. His research interests span from the Archaic period through to the entire Hellenistic world. He's a pioneer in introducing and really dealing with material culture and integrating material culture into the historical discourse. It is therefore for these reasons that we have asked him to present a topic which is difficult to treat. Material culture change in material culture. Robin, the floor is yours.
Katerina, thank you very much. I think we've briefly lost John, but since John has read my paper, he doesn't need to be here. I'll nevertheless start with a remark about John, which is to say that one of the things we value, particularly I think in John, and it's been clear, has been valued enormously all over the place in the last 20 years, has been his ability to sum up conferences and to find ways of directing a conference into a shape, giving a conference a shape at the end of it. I rather defy him to do that with this conference. I don't think I've ever been to a conference where there have been so many different interpretations of what on earth it is that we're being asked to do. And lo and behold, what you're about to get is yet another interpretation of what the instruction was. So I apologize to anybody who thinks that the instruction was clearly something very different from what I'm about to deliver. It also seems to me that one of the most fascinating things about this conference has been how reluctant people are to actually talk about change. We've all been much more happy with continuity or with just sort of changes on the small scale, and we don't want to stand back and talk about changes on the big scale. So I guess I'm by nature a lumper, not a splitter. So here's a big lump. It's long seemed obvious to scholars working on Greek antiquity that different aspects of material culture, which I take to include visual culture, have their own histories. That was true already for ancient scholars like Pliny, who decides that the way to do history is by substance. It's true for modern scholars who study sculpture in one study, pottery in another, mosaics in another, burial customs in another. There are some histories of Greek art that try to tell a single story, though many effectively break down into separate stories of separate artistic media. But when books claim to be studies of the art and archaeology of ancient Greece, or just the archaeology of ancient Greece, they turn out to be largely descriptive, without significant historical analysis, or to be very partial coverages of the range of actual material culture. All of this suggests that writing the history of material culture change in the Aegean, or anywhere else, is impossible. If it could be done, would it not have been done? But there are both theoretical and practical reasons why this must be wrong. The theoretical reason is that material culture impinges upon every form of human activity, and that every form of human activity impinges upon material culture. If we think that we can write economic or social or political history, or even arguably literary history, we need to believe that we can also write a history of material culture. The practical reason why it must be possible to write a history of material culture is that we write our own histories the whole time. That is, we are completely capable of recognizing, for any society with which we're familiar, what period some particular material manifestation belongs to. So we in the UK place houses, fashions, painting, gravestones into the Georgian period, the Victorian period, the interwar period, whatever. And we do so actually with a high degree of accuracy. More than that, for all that there are local, regional, and national peculiarities, we also find that our knowledge of material culture change in one place serves as a basic template against which to measure material culture change in other places. Material culture change is certainly not random, but heavily patterned, and patterned on a very large scale. So why have scholars failed to write the history that both must be possible to write, and that, in some sense, they all know? The answer to this I take to be primarily that it's just too hard to do. The quantity and range of material is enormous, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is that, as even those keenest on the agency of the object must acknowledge, objects do things because they're made to do things. That is, material culture is, as the name implies, material that has been cultivated. And it's the changing manner of its cultivation that gives it its history. Material culture is an index. When we read the history of material culture, we do not read the history of clay or stone, but of individuals and societies that put clay or stone or whatever to use. By this stage of the conference, the history of material culture should already have been written by those who've told the story of political or economic or social, etc., change. To account for material culture change, one must tell again all of those stories and simultaneously. Doing anything that's rigorous and has any chance of bringing significant enlightenment is therefore at least implausible, if not simply impossible. So why am I embarking on an enterprise that seems doomed from the start? Well, the answer to that is that that's what Kostas told me to do. And if I share anything with John Davies, it's a weakness for saying yes. I have a weakness for doing what I've been told to do. And it's only going to take 20 minutes more of your time. One way of thinking about historical change is in terms of changing distribution. Economic history is about the changing distribution of goods, political distribution about the changing distribution of power, social history about the changing distribution of individuals into social groups and social groups into bigger social groups, legal history about the changing distribution of individual freedom and state control, and so on. But distributions of power in social groups, of freedom, let alone of goods, all display themselves in changing attitudes to materiality. It's because the manifold qualities of the material world, size, shape, texture, weight, density, reflectivity, color, uniqueness, seriality, one can go on and on. It's because these are appreciated differently in relation to one another that people come to see and feel, but also to think about and value the material world differently. And in doing so, appreciate where power, wealth, status, freedom, and so on lie. And such changes in ways of seeing, feeling, valuing, thinking about the material world impinge on a whole range of thought worlds, indeed upon every aspect of life, economic, political, social, religious, sexual, literary, and so we go on. Now, it might be objected to such abstract reasoning that the same is true of any areas of history that we're thinking about. The changing distribution of goods, that is economic history, affects and is affected by the changing distribution of individuals into social groups, that is social history, the changing distribution of supernatural power, that is religious history, and so on. And it's true that the relationship between many different areas of history is close. But it's the peculiarity of material culture, I would claim, that since the instantiation of every type of history comes through the material world, material culture change feeds very directly into all other types of culture change, and is itself fed, of course, by all other types of culture change. While this makes explaining material culture change particularly hard, it also makes material culture change an extremely important barometer, and indeed potentially an instrument of wider cultural change. I'm going to take two case studies of change in material culture. You can more or less predict, I suspect, which these are going to be. The first is the change that takes place at the end of the 8th century BC, marked most obviously by the end of geometric style of pottery and the rise of so-called orientalizing. And the second is the change that takes place around the beginning of the 5th century BC and marks the transition between archaic and classical. That is, in some sense, I'm going to revisit work that I published in 1989, ouch, and in 2018. The change in material culture at the end of the 8th century is most marked in terms of pottery styles, most marked for us at least, probably pretty much most marked for contemporaries. The patterns of geometric decoration, organized in and by horizontal bands, had prevailed for something like 300 years, taking forms that were distinct in different regions, but with a great deal in common between regional styles, such that it takes quite a lot of study to distinguish some of them, and that there's as much difference between different workshops at a single place as there is between many different places. The introduction of some figurative decoration in panels within geometric decoration had increased the degree of difference between different local styles, but many figurative motifs occurred widely, not just horses, birds, attacks by wild animals, but also, for instance, dancers. There are different shape preferences too between different places, but also much in common with arabelloi, amphoras, jugs, craters of more or less indistinguishable shape produced in widely separate centres. After 700, all this disappears more or less rapidly. Even the most conservative of pottery traditions sees the shape of its products change markedly. Take, for instance, Ionian bird bowls. Old shapes, like amphoras, are variously modified. New shapes appear, but above all, the decoration takes on a quite new appearance with new decorative motifs, particularly curvilinear patterns, including gouache, and many large figures. Painted writing appears with explicit reference to mythological scenes, and other scenes identify themselves as mythological by their content. Figures identifiable as divine appear in scenes. Experiments are also made with polychromy and with relief decoration. But discontinuities are found in other aspects of material culture too. In Athens, although there is continuity in burial sites, there's a marked change in burial practice, from inhumation to primary cremation, with grave goods deposited not in the grave, but in offering trenches. At both Athens and Corinth, burial plots within the inhabited area are largely abandoned around 700, and only cemeteries outside the inhabited area continue in use. Equally striking in Athens, and probably not in Athens alone, the numbers of individuals granted archaeologically visible burial fall dramatically. They fall back, indeed, to the level they'd been at before around 800. Although now the selection of who is buried may be different and may be gendered as it was not before. In sanctuaries, the evidence is not very clear, but although one might take the appearance in the 8th century of temples to signal also the appearance of substantial cult statues, familiar to listeners to Iliad 6 in the form that we have it, the earliest large-scale statues, and perhaps themselves cult statues, are the statues from around 700 from Dryros in Crete. In the next century, large-scale figures will appear in a number of sanctuaries, including Delos and the Athenian Acropolis. In a number of sanctuaries, the quantity of material dedicated also much increases at the end of the 8th century, including at sanctuaries as far apart as Sparta, Artemis Orthia Sanctuary, Pherae in Thessaly, and Lindos, Sanctuary of Athena. The traditional explanation for these changes has been contained in the use of the name orientalizing. Boardman's suggestion, in his early Greek vase painting, that Euboean sailors explored the coast of Syria and, quotes, set free that flow of Eastern goods that created Greece's orientalizing revolution, is typical of the older view. But it's long been clear now that Greeks were very familiar with orientalizing goods throughout the Dark Ages, certainly back to the Lefkandi Tumba building, and so back to 1000 BC or so. Athenian goldsmiths in the 8th century had produced both orientalizing and geometric diadems, presumably according to local demand. Once we stop thinking simply in terms of changes in pottery and think more generally about changes in material culture, any attractions that waves of orientalizing have as an explanation disappear. The Athenians did not move to primary cremation or to the exclusion of most of the population from archaeologically visible burial because of anything that they learned from or about the East. Does the thought that what material culture changes do is distribute awareness of materiality different help? I suggest that it does, or at least that it's worth thinking about whether it does. Take the decision to separate habitation and burial. That seems to presuppose deciding that the dead are different, not just known individuals now in a new condition, but known individuals who have now been transformed in some way. That's particularly clear with Athenian practices of primary cremation. It's hardly surprising that the more elaborate grave and ceremonial that primary cremation required should not be appropriately carried out close to habitation, nor that it affected a major change of status, and that what gets put into offering trenches is something different from the everyday pottery put into 8th century inhumations, reinforces that difference. But we see this too with what is painted on pottery. For all that there are centaurs on some late geometric pottery, the scenes on late geometric pots primarily invite comparison with life, all those famous prophecy scenes on Athenian pots destined to go in the grave or on it, or the scenes of lyre players and dancers, or indeed of soldiers and sailors. 7th century pots invite the viewer into a world of story, sometimes, as with the Judgment of Paris, a story that could be translated into life, but often a story with a monster, the Cyclops, Nessos, the Gorgons. The ability to represent the immaterial, the sense that a world could be conjured up by an artist, as by a poet, that world could be made materially present, as through the sizable statues of the gods, these all point to a flagging up and at the same time a denial of the difference between the material and the immaterial. Two features of this change in material culture are important. The first is that it's highly unlikely that it's spontaneous or internally generated. Even if one thinks that it's inevitable that someone would challenge the rectilinearity of geometric designs with rebellious curves, it was hardly inevitable that inhumation turned into primary cremation. The changed distribution of awareness of materiality must be stimulated by other changing distributions. Of those other distributions, changing distributions of power, of political power, that are not implausible in the 8th century, and changing distributions of goods, which are certain in the 8th century, offer little purchase, I think. More plausibly, the changed distribution of awareness of materiality is stimulated by changed distribution of supernatural power. That is, increasing consciousness of what is not under human control. The rise of the Greek sanctuary is manifest in the 8th century in a number of ways, some of which plug in directly to our story of material culture change. Arguably, the mirage of a population explosion has distracted scholars from the really explosive developments of the 8th century, which are religious. Snodgrass's later claims about the change from raw to converted offerings, though overgeneralized, may, I think, be more important than his famous, perhaps infamous, graphs of burial numbers. My second study is the transition from the archaic to the classical period, the end of the kouros and korea, the effective disappearance of almost all regional styles of fine pottery, the dramatic changes in dedicatory practices, sharp decline in temple building, Athens aside, the advent of Spartan austerity. Above all, the invention of the classical style, with all that that entails in terms of changing subject matter of art and changing relation of sculpture and viewer. All these point to radical material culture change. This has long been recognized and is marked by the deep-rooted convention of dividing discussions of all forms of art between archaic and classical. The deep-rooted convention has also been to explain the changes from within material culture. So changes in sculpture are seen on the one hand to relate to changed materials and techniques, technological developments that enable large-scale bronzes to be produced, enable human figures to be conceived that are not cut down from and constrained by the block, but are built up and molded. New techniques of pot painting enable the three-dimensionality of bodies to be evoked more effectively. On the other hand, cumulative developments in registering the details of life make possible the capture not simply of broad types of person, but individual people, not just vague impressions of bodies in movement, but bodies that closely reproduce the details of bodies in movement. Such explanations have considerable merit, but they explain only a narrow range of the material culture changes. It's easy to see how these technological changes and developments in capturing life might see off the kouros and korre. Much harder to see why they should see off regional styles, or bring about a marked change in dedicatory practice, or the advent of Spartan austerity. Nor is it clear why they should be associated with a wholesale change in the subject matter of art. What would it be to think about these changes as changes in the distribution of awareness of materiality? If the changes in material culture at the end of the 8th century was marked by sharper definition of categories, marking off the dead or the gods as ontologically different from living humans, marking women off more sharply as different from men, not just needing another shape of pot to mark their graves, but a whole different burial rite, the changes at the end of the 6th century might be characterized as marked by growing awareness of the importance of variations within those categories, by the need to register something other than a single male or female experience. But at the same time, by the recognition that many conventional divisions, such as divisions between city-states or Greek ethne, did not map onto the observed world, where individuals might sit comfortably with one group on one set of criteria, but with another group on another set of criteria. What we're dealing with is a sense of the relativity of materiality, a sense that might lead on the one hand to extreme individualism, recognizing nothing but difference and particularity, and on the other hand, to ideal types. The way to grasp the world is through thinking through de-individualized types, not through coming face to face with some supposed mirror of oneself, as in korai and kouroi, but through getting inside the mind of the youth in the gymnasium, the hoplite going to war, the woman in the household. But if the material culture change we are facing is markedly new awareness of the relativity of materiality, how are we to count for it? There is, once more, a religious dimension to this. There's no doubt that we do see a changing distribution of supernatural power, manifested, among other things, in the new gods' bodies that Phidias produces. But in this case, that changed distribution of supernatural power and those new bodies are more easily seen as a product than cause of the new sense of relativity of materiality. We might be tempted by a political explanation. Not only did Athens see a change in the distribution of political power within the polis, there were certainly changes in the distribution of political power across polis. That there's some relationship between developing democracy and a growing sense of the relativity of materiality seems clear. But in which direction does this relationship go? Some sense of the relativity of materiality seems an essential prerequisite of democracy. Similarly, there's some relationship between the disappearance from material culture of regionalism and the changed distribution of political power across polis. But the direction of the relationship is not obviously from politics to material culture. Purely economic explanations seem to me implausible. The sense of the relativity of materiality surely needs something more than a change in the distribution of goods to prompt it. But changes in the distribution of individuals into social groups and of social groups into larger social groups looks more promising. It's precisely issues of classification and its discontents that lie behind what I've called the relativity of materiality. Two things might be thought about here. The invention of new social groups that followed from Athenian restructuring, and the redistribution of power from old phratries and nacreries to demes, and the restructuring of social groups that comes as a consequence of the slave population reaching a particular proportion of the population as a whole. So economic change comes into the picture after all. Whether you're attracted to this might depend on how much of a materialist you are. I'm sufficient of an immaterialist, as my wanting to see a religious background changes around 700 shows, to think that the history we might need here is a history of values, otherwise known as popular morality. That is, the story of the distribution of moral worth, and that the sense of relativity of materiality comes from a changed distribution of moral value that puts the emphasis, following Foucault, on restraint, enkrateia, rather than on achievement, collaboration rather than competition, in Arthur Adkins' much despised language, but it has something to say for itself. But the point of this discussion has not been to explain material culture change at any particular point in history. It's been to think about what a history of material culture change might look like. That's the way I interpreted my brief. So what might a history of material culture change look like? Well, not like any existing account of Greek art and archaeology anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin, for a very interesting and very broad discussion. You're bringing in a lot of issues here. Are there any questions? Let me just check. Artemis Karnava, Dr. Artemis Karnava.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I can't help myself. I'm an archaeologist, so I have to ask you. So how would you think about, I think I asked this question because this is my way of thinking about changes. I think of economy and economic changes and political changes as the basis of change. What are the, I mean, broadly speaking, economic or political landmarks that you would place at the beginning? And in these two periods, what are the most significant, do you think, that sort of affect your model?
Yeah, I mean, on my version of what economic change is, I think I generally don't think that economic change is a driver that we're going to see, you know, in either of these two cases, or perhaps more generally. It seems to me that the changes are always going to be changes in human relationships, because it's what we do with material culture is use it to relate to one another in one sort of a way or another. Now, you can't really have substantial changes in human relationships without that having a knock-on effect politically. And you can't have a massive change in political organization without that having a knock-on effect in changing human relationships, it seems to me. So I think there will always be some sort of relationship, however tight or loose, between substantial changes in material culture and politics. There are always going to be some consequences in terms of economics, because of the fact that if you want to start using material culture in a different way, that sets up a whole new sets of demands for different things. But I think that we are in general, going to be in a world which is demand rather than supply led here. And so I see economic change much more as a consequence than as a cause of material culture change. Now, all of that is to skip your question as to what I would then want to point to at the end of the, I mean, it's clear what I want to point to at the end of the 6th century, I think, in terms of political change. At the end of the 8th century, that I think is much more up for grabs. But I wouldnde one of the interesting things about the change at that moment is that it goes across wide areas of Greece. So we need something to be happening to human relations generally that ought to be reflected in politics more generally. But there are rather few places where one has really any independent purchase on politics beyond what one concludes out of the material culture record. So you're very quickly into circularity here. I think I do want, in terms of the sort of story I would want to tell about Athens and Attica, where the material culture record is particularly rich, I do want to see a political change here, and it's a political change towards, perhaps for the first time, strongly coordinated government, to call it, use that word in the most general terms. The community has found ways of ordering itself, ways that are then reflected in its ability to sufficiently to monopolize legitimate violence to produce all those shackled burials at Phaleron some point in the 7th century. So I do think that there is something political that is happening at around this time. There's no way we can pinpoint it to 700, but I would want to see a correlation between material culture change as I've described it and political change in that sort of way. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
Oh, no, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Hans would like to
yes,
also
thanks very much. Thank you, Robin. Spectacular paper. Really interesting. I was very helpful your previous answer as well in terms of the the relation between human relationships, as you rightly call them, and then the I think actually that's something I just want to really strongly endorse, that economics on the one hand and ideas and values on the other hand, but right at the center of it all there are these human relationships. I think they're kind of clearly well, I would say probably the driving factor. But I would say once you posit that, it becomes pretty easy to really then link economics and indeed values into it as well. In that one way or another, these are clearly between all of them. I would say in some cases, it may well be that human relationships start economic changes that then gain a certain dynamic of their own, and ditto with values. Once human relationships have changed to the point that they produce to legitimate or explain, society to themselves, key values, then maybe these also gain a certain driving force of their own. But ultimately, I think, I just wanted to strongly endorse the idea that ultimately what we're seeing in material culture is a direct or indirect reflection of changing social relationships, and therefore a plea for social history, which I think in effect is what you're making as well. But having said that, just my question though, and it's probably a very unfair question, but inevitably when we're looking at material culture, we're looking at what survives, i.e. in stone, pottery and metal with any luck. The possibility that in sort of perishable material culture, important things are happening that we really ought to also, take into account, but quite often can't. You specifically mentioned, like large-scale stone statues. Clearly a striking development, but some of the biggest statues are made of wood, I guess, with layers on top of them. And if we didn't have descriptions of Phidias, his Zeus, we would have no idea about it, I suppose. So there's an issue about the half or more of material culture that we're missing, and and how we feed that back into our picture. Sorry, this is getting quite long-winded, but just one tiny example, which I personally really like, is a proto-Attic vase, a prothesis, seen very much in the curvilinear sort of proto-Attic style, where one of the mourning women has a decorated dress, a peplos, with a figure of a mourning woman on it in the geometric style. So this is like 30 years out of date by the time the painter on the vase shows it. Does that suggest that, in other media we have, there's a time lag in change, or is this some kind of clever artistic play? I really don't know, but it does, for me, raise the question as to, what are we really analyzing when we're trying to analyze what survives?
Yeah, okay. Two responses to that. The first is just to add into my, having gone for human relationships, I should actually have said interpersonal relationships, where the persons would include supernatural persons. I think we shouldn't just be doing social history here. We need to have religious history into this picture and see that those two are absolutely bound up together. On the second point, I suppose I think that we have the half, your surviving half of material culture is sufficiently diverse in its nature that we can have some reasonable confidence that it looks quite like the missing half of the material culture. I mean, not obviously sort of literally, but in terms of the sorts of things that are happening. So it seems to me that take wooden statues, right? Well, we might have wooden statues that go back, a long way, but actually it would be extremely surprising to find those in the 8th century, given that although we've got on 8th century pots a whole lot of images that are interested in ritual, right? They show dancing and so on. We don't have any indication that we've got cult statues as a focus for this activity and so on. So I'm slightly disinclined to sort of think that there might be trump cards out there that suddenly we're going to get a wonderful waterlogged site and it's going to reveal to us a whole world of wood that looks that completely wrong foots us as to date, right? That looks just like the 7th century stuff, but it's actually 9th century or whatever. I think that's relatively implausible. With your wonderful proto-Attic pot, I suppose what comes to me as a comparison, and partly in particular responding to you, is to have a nice round shield, which has as its shields device a dipylon shield. I imagine the same sort of thing is happening there. How do you refer to art? How do you show that it is actually art? Well, you show it by having an artistic style that is distinct, and that is likely to mean going back. Just as how do you show a round shield on a round shield? Well, that's a particularly difficult problem, but you can do it by going to something else which people recognise as a shield, as it were.
Okay. Sorry, Gunnar?
Yes, well, Robin, first, thank you very much for your wonderfully broad scope of your paper. I have a question about regionality, and I'm wondering what parts of the Greek world you're taking into account with your model, and maybe what other parts of the Greek world make as much sense in the light of your model. And I'm sorry that this question is coming from somebody working on Cretan history and Cretan material culture, which does not seem to follow this pattern, at least not for the second period that you were describing. For the first, we can agree on that. Well, no, the second, it's obviously different, but I really lack the knowledge about the diverse regions of Greek material culture, and maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Well, probably not very satisfactorily. I mean, your point is obviously extremely well made, and actually, I mean, Crete is pretty interesting even for my earlier change, where things are happening in Crete, as I understand it, on a distinctly different chronology. So Crete does seem to operate as a different world where changes are happening differently and in different ways, though not they're not universally, but certainly within material culture, and one of the useful things I think that the material culture, that actually looking at material culture enables us to do, is to see the constant redefinition of well, what we might call being Greek, as it were, but do you want to signal that you are doing the same thing as everybody else in the Greek mainland, or do you want to signal that you are actually doing differently? And material culture is a very ready way of signaling that sort of difference. And there are certainly regions which are often wanting to signal one thing at one period and another thing at another period. And that clearly has to come into the discussion, and on the sort of broadest of frameworks. One can see that one reason for doing that might be that actually the material culture that is being produced by most of the cities on the mainland buys into a set of values, a set of ways of thinking about human relationships you really don't want to buy into. At which point, there are other models out there. You can go and buy into those. So that's the sort of way in which I think I would deal with the really interesting ways in which you get cultural conformity, as it were, over a wide area at some points, and then high degrees of separateness at other points.
Okay. Vincent?
Yes, thank you so much, Robin. This is very, very thought-provoking, and it set me on. I mean, how complicated these relationships can be. I just thought, while you were speaking, I was thinking of another case study. I mean, it is not within the periods of time that you have discussed, but in Hellenistic times. And this example shows the complexity or the complex relationship between values, politics, economics, materiality as such, and fashion or taste. I'm thinking of the gold crowns, the award or the honor of gold crowns. From my poor knowledge of the epigraphic material of the Greek world, I can see in some places at least, the goldsmiths must have been on the job on a daily basis. And working frantically to produce all these crowns. Now, this is a kind of materiality we know from the actual finds of gold crowns, a very luxurious item, very, very nice craftsmanship, and from the inscriptions awarding the crowns. I don't think that anybody has studied this kind of thing systematically yet, but it would be fantastic to see, in different locales, how much bullion, how much gold was being used, to compare the epigraphic record with the material record. Anyway, this is the complex relationship between moral values, patriotism, eruditism, philotimia, and so forth. This is the justification of being awarded a gold crown, and then the production of all these moral and patriotic persons that deserve the crowns, and then the goldsmiths working all the time to produce the crowns, and the goldsmiths get richer and richer from that, and therefore they invest in munificence, and they get themselves awarded good gold crowns. Anyway, you can see the faulos kyklos, the vicious circle in this, I mean, making things extremely complicated. This is, I mean, do you have any thoughts about it?
I do think it's a particularly interesting case, isn't it? Because there's a sort of practice here which is crowning.
Yeah.
And then within crowning, there are very distinct practices as to whether the crown is worth anything or not worth anything. And to some extent, one starts by thinking that that's a sort of trivial distinction, and that clearly you want a slightly more special crown, so you don't make it a crown of olive leaves, you make it a crown of metal, and so on. And then you realize actually this is a really substantial distinction. Yeah. And it has, as you suggest, all these knock-on effects that are going to change relationships in a whole variety of ways. So that's perhaps quite a nice, that's a nice way to see that what looks like a single institution then can itself be interpreted in very different ways that then go on to have further consequences, which are themselves political amongst other things. So yeah, a really nice example to think with.
I mean, well, the crown comes from the athletic or the agonistic.
Yeah.
And why a crown? This is a fashion, this is a taste, and so forth. And so on. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
No.
We also have one question from John Knight. Okay, I'm just... John?
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Professor Osborne. That was a really fascinating paper, and it's made me think quite a lot about these issues with which I'm kind of a little bit familiar with, but I apologise now that I'm going to ask quite a simplistic question. The two case studies that you used there, I just kind of noted when you were talking about them that in the previous half century to both of these changes at the turn of the kind of 8th to 7th century and the 6th to the 5th, that you could maybe see a widening of Aegean horizons, a widening of Greek horizons in the earlier period through kind of what's conventionally called the colonization movement, the beginnings of that at least, and in the later movement with increased interaction with Persia. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on whether this has what the relationship between that and changes in materiality and in kind of the human relationships that you're talking about would be.
I'm an optimist, or at least I have a maximal view of the degree of interaction across the Mediterranean from back in the 9th century, not sure where I would want to begin it, but certainly back in the 9th century onwards. I actually don't think that explanations or claims about isolation are at all plausible, really, at any date that we're talking about. I've written about this recently with regard to wanting to argue about variations within the alphabet, so local scripts, being not a matter of not knowing, but a matter of consciously distinguishing. And I think that the alphabet is a great way of showing that it's pretty clear that this invention spread very fast, unless you're someone who thinks that it was sort of dormant and we just have no evidence for several centuries until we suddenly get evidence. But I think I'm inclined to think that the earliest evidence probably comes near the point of invention. It then spreads extremely fast, showing how well connected everywhere it is. But despite the fact that this is a medium of communication where you might think that there is maximum reason for standardization, actually the motivations for distinguishing yourself are great enough so that everybody writes it slightly differently. But I think that that's happening across the 9th and 8th century more generally, that you can't do anything in Athens without someone on the other side of the Aegean learning about it pretty fast. And I suspect that that goes not just within the Greek world, but actually across the central Mediterranean in general. So I don't tend to think that we've got massively increased connectivity. We've certainly got changes in the uses of that connectivity, but that's a different matter.
Thank you.
We have two more questions. One from Christy Konstantakopoulou, and then Marek Pekovsky.
Hi, Robin. Thank you very much. I mean, wow. You did mention circularity, though, so I want to pick up on that.
Yeah.
So why do human relationships change? And then that has a knock-on effect on the other stuff.
That's a perfectly good question. Yeah. And the answer must be there's no single reason why human relationships change. That potentially the catalyst can be massively different. I mean, you only have to think in terms of 20th century history. So, at what point would one think, I'm sorry, I'm thinking in UK terms again, but some of these at least I think are translatable. In UK history, the sort of big breaks that one would see would be the end of World War I, right? And then I shall claim, and John may have a different perspective on this and say it's just my particular age, I think that 1979 is also a pretty fundamental change. Now, the changes from World War I are the changes from a world war. They're not changes to do with individual politicians. The 1979 change is the arrival of the Iron Lady and a completely new way of construing human relations, more or less directly for political and ideological purposes. And we're still living in the wake of that, as I see it, at least. So there are two examples. The ancient world must be like that too. Right? Large wars have strong effects, but occasionally, actually, the charismatic individual in an individual city may set going a way of thinking and relating that other people. Well, I suppose we get to Gunnar's cartelization, right? I would want to see cartels, in a sense, people finding it in there, suddenly realizing that there's an opportunity to do something, if they sort of construe things differently, as a potential way of interpreting things. So I doubt that we will always be able to find the cause, because these things have a domino effect. Right. And we may only catch these things when actually a number of dominoes have started to fall.
So this was interesting because you went on two completely different directions there. One that I didn't expect, which was the primacy of the event, which I find very difficult to believe in, even when we do know the events. And I think that's even more difficult when we don't know the events. And then you went into a completely different tack, which is the wider economic change of what Gunnar and Vincent have talked, which is not related to events or charismatic leaders. So if you think in terms of, construct understandings of history, one is a very old traditional understanding of history, one is a completely different understanding of history, but for you, they have the same kind of rationale behind your change of relationships, as understanding. I'm a very old Marxist myself, and very, very stuck in my ways. So I see the things in kind of black and white in that respect. So for me, it's fascinating that you can combine these two in the same kind of hermeneutic procedure, if you see what I mean.
I think that's what history does.
We can't hear you, Katerina.
Sorry. We have two more questions from attendees, and I'm going back to the panelists. Milan Prodanovic, you can talk. Milan? Milan, can you hear us?
Seems to have disappeared from the list, so
yeah,
maybe it's a technical question.
Okay, in that
No,
case.
he appeared again, so if you can give him the microphone.
Yes, Milan?
Muted again.
I'm muting him. Yes, Milan, you can talk. No.
Now?
Yes, yes, Milan, I can hear you.
Thank you very much. We have this small problem. I would like to ask which difference has made the study of material culture in the last decades, and how it has changed the known political and historical narrative that used to be predominantly based on the literary sources. In fact, how the material culture contradicts the literary sources. Is there any known example in the last few decades, from, let's say, the 80s to now?
It sounds as if you have an example in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to, as it were, challenge me with an example?
No, I would like to know one example, because how, let's say, the material culture contradicts or it shows a different picture from the literary sources.
I don't think I have any interest in claiming that it is going to contradict. Indeed, I sort of saw it as a challenge if you could come up with an example that did contradict. I mean, that is, literary culture is as likely to be, indeed, as certainly affected by human relations and changing nature of human relationships and ways of thinking about human relationships, as is material culture. So one would expect them to be, in some sense, in step.
The only known example to me, at least I have read the book of Anthony Snodgrass that was some decades ago, regarding the Boeotian city of Mykalysos, that apparently Thucydides says that it was never inhabited again, but the archaeological excavations showed that we have a continued inhabitation after it's sacked from the Thracian mercenaries that arrived in Athens. And I would like to ask how, actually my question was whether we have, let's say, one picture that, for example, one area is economically richer than we thought, because in literary, in text, we don't have so many information regarding many cities and many regions of Greece, while on the other hand, archaeology shows something different.
Okay, so there are lots of examples where ancient historians get things wrong, or they make claims that are tendentious and seem to be very unlikely to us. But that seems to me to be a different sort of issue. So I don't think that has much bearing on what we think about what we can do with material culture. one could bring it up with the contradiction in the ancient sources as to whether Attica was fertile or not. Thucydides says, no, 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 it's not. Xenophon and others imply, yes, 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 it is. But, you know, that contradiction is not itself, I think, going to impinge upon our understanding of the role that material culture might want to play. It might make it more difficult for us to assess, but it doesn't actually. The fact that someone in antiquity perceives it differently is more likely to be to do with what Christian Sylvain would have called their perceptual filters. Than it is to do with a substantial methodological issue for us, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're basically running out of time. I was wondering whether John Knight wanted to speak again, because I mean, he had raised hand, which I don't see now. Okay, and then I was wondering whether Artemis Karnava and Marek Vekovsky would like to speak again.
Can I just speak up very briefly on the point that Christy made? I think with the answer that you gave, Christy, you made my point, because this is the sort of events that I sort of had in mind. So I mentioned economic change, and I see war as a mostly economic phenomenon, because it does change economic relations between people and it affects their behavior. And then you mentioned a political elections. So a political event as a catalyst for change. I can understand that at the same time, all events or facts or whatever, they can be cause and effect. They are the effect of previous actions, and at the same time, when they happen and after they happen, they cause more things. So do you see these events that you mentioned, these sort of catalysts, as cause or effect? Would you?
I think you've answered your own question. They're always going to be, you know, that's what we do in history, as it were, is we attempt to tell a story of the whole string of cause and effect. What is particularly interesting in the case of material culture is that there are moments when we see absolutely widespread change. Right? And there are moments when we don't. And there is undoubtedly, I mean, when we've talked at various points in this conference about periodization, but there are moments of reorientation. And what seems to me to be important there is to try to appreciate what it is that is in common between all the things that are changing at the same time. It's that coordinated change, how you make sense of coordinated change, that seems to me to be actually more important than going back and pointing your finger to, you know, all of this was caused by the flapping of this particular butterfly's wing. It's actually understanding the consequences seems to be much more important than pointing the finger at the guilty party.
Thank you. We can agree to disagree, maybe. Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Robin, for a very enlightening paper. I would like to thank all the panelists for the morning session, and we will have our lunch break, and we will reconvene at 4 o'clock, or, you know, at any time it is where you are at the moment.
4 o'clock Greek time.
Exactly, 4 o'clock Greek time. Thank you so much, everyone. Well, I hope you have a nice lunch break at the moment. Thank you.